Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the world just beneath the surface, just past the edge of what we can easily see, turns out to be stranger and more beautiful than anything we expected. There is a particular kind of disappearance that has nothing to do with destruction. No fire, no conquest, no slow erosion of stone by wind. Some things do not crumble, they simply go quiet, and then they go under. A city can sink the way a ship does. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, almost gently, until the water closes over it and the surface becomes smooth again, and the world above carries on as if nothing was ever there. Tonight we're going somewhere most people have never heard of, even though it was once one of the most important ports in the ancient world. We are going to the northern coast of Egypt, to a bay called Abu Qir, roughly 6.5 kilometres off the modern shoreline. We're going down through about 6 metres of warm, silt-clouded Mediterranean water, past centuries of accumulated sediment, to a place that spent over 1,000 years being described as a myth, a name that appeared in old Greek texts without a physical address, without coordinates, without proof. The name is Thonis-Heracleion, and it is real. It always was. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you in bed, with the lights off and the room cooling down around you? Are you somewhere outside with the night air coming in through a window? Is it raining where you are? Or quiet? What is the temperature? I always find myself curious about that, about the small physical details of wherever you're sitting or lying when these stories find you. There is something I like about the idea that someone is hearing this in a warm room in one part of the world, and someone else is hearing it on a cool night somewhere else entirely, and we're all in our different places thinking about the same thing. A city that sank beneath the sea and waited 2,000 years to be found. If you're new here, welcome. If you have been here before, it is genuinely good to have you back. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, slow, careful, unhurried, then a like and a subscribe means more than you might think. It helps this channel keep going, and it helps other people who might need exactly this kind of thing at the end of a long day find their way here. So if you feel like it, go ahead, and then settle in because we have a lot of ground to cover, or rather, a lot of water. Now, let us begin with the strangeness of the situation, because it is genuinely strange. The Mediterranean Sea has been a human highway for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Romans, they all moved across it, traded across it, built their most important cities along its edges. The Nile Delta, where the great river fans out into the sea, was one of the most densely inhabited and commercially vital regions of the ancient world. Ships came from Athens, from Corinth, from the islands of the Aegean, loaded with olive oil and wine and silver, and they arrived at the coast of Egypt looking for grain and linen and papyrus and gold. This was a well-travelled, well-documented part of the world, and yet, somewhere in that well-travelled, well-documented part of the world, an entire city had been sitting on the seafloor for roughly 1,000 years without anyone knowing exactly where it was. That is not a small thing to wrap your mind around. We are not talking about a village, or a temple complex, or a cluster of ruins. We are talking about a city, a functioning, thriving, politically and economically significant city, that served as the main customs port for all of Egypt for several centuries. A city with a grand temple at its centre, with canals and harbours and streets and warehouses and a Greek quarter and an Egyptian quarter and sacred boats and statues and tax collectors and merchants and priests. A city that the Greek historian Herodotus had visited in person around 450 BCE and written about. A city that had 2 names, Thonis, the Egyptian name, and Heracleion, the Greek name, because it was used by 2 different cultures who each called it something different and both considered it important. This city was not obscure. It was not a footnote. It was, for a long time, the front door of Egypt. And then it was gone, not destroyed, not burned, not conquered and abandoned. It sank. The ground beneath it, soft and waterlogged and unstable as the Nile Delta has always been, eventually gave way. The sea came in, the buildings went under, the streets filled with silt. And over the following centuries, the memory of the city faded from something real and specific into something that felt more like a legend, a name in old texts that scholars debated, a place that some believed was simply another name for a city they already knew, or perhaps a place that had never quite existed the way the old writers described it. For more than 1,000 years, no one knew where Thonis-Heracleion was. Not exactly. There were guesses, there were theories, there were comparisons of ancient texts and arguments about geography. But the city itself, its stones, its statues, its ships, its inscriptions, was sitting quietly in Abu Kirbe under the water waiting. It was found in the year 2000. And the story of how it was found and what was there, and what it tells us about the ancient world, is something we're going to spend a long time with tonight. But before we get to the discovery itself, it is worth sitting with the question of why no one found it sooner. Because Abu Kirbe is not a remote, inaccessible place. It is not deep ocean. The water there is relatively shallow, 6 meters, roughly the height of a 2-story building. Fishing boats have crossed that bay for centuries. The Egyptian coast is not uninhabited or unstudied, and yet the city stayed hidden. Part of the answer is the silt. The Nile Delta deposits extraordinary amounts of fine sediment, and over 2,000 years, that sediment had covered the ruins of Thonis-Heracleion in a thick protective layer. From above, from a boat, there was nothing to see. The seafloor looked like seafloor. There were no visible columns, no obvious shapes, no signs that anything lay underneath. The city had been effectively sealed. Part of the answer is also the state of underwater archaeology itself. For most of human history, the tools simply did not exist to search for something like this systematically. Diving was limited, visibility was poor, and the technology needed to scan the seafloor in any meaningful way was not available until the late 20th century. Even then, it required a specific kind of dedication, the kind that involves years of surveying a bay that most people had already written off as unremarkable. And part of the answer, honestly, is that people had stopped looking. The city had been missing for so long, had been so thoroughly absorbed into the category of probably mythological, or probably somewhere else, that the active search had more or less ended before it really began. What changed that was a French underwater archaeologist named Frank Goddio. But we will come to him properly in a moment. For now, I want to stay with the image of the city as it was, as it existed at its height, before any of this happened. Because it is easy, when we talk about lost cities, to think of them as ruins from the start, to imagine them already half collapsed, already dusty and faded, already on their way to becoming the things we eventually find. But Thonis-Heracleion was not always a ruin. It was not always silent. There was a time when it was loud, when its harbours were full of ships from across the Mediterranean, their sails coming down as they entered the sheltered anchorage, when merchants were arguing about prices in Greek and Egyptian, and whatever else people spoke in a busy port, when the smell of fish and cedar wood and burning incense mixed together in the air near the docks, when priests were moving through the great temple of Amun-Gereb in the centre of the city, preparing for the ceremonies that only happened here, in this place, at this time of year. When a pharaoh was arriving by boat to receive the divine blessing that would make his kingship legitimate in the eyes of the gods. That city existed. It was real. People were born there, worked there, grew old there. Ships came and went for centuries. The temple was maintained and expanded. The canals were dredged. The tax records were kept. Life happened here, in enormous quantities, for an enormous amount of time, and then gradually the ground began to shift. That is the story we are following tonight. Not just the discovery of Thonis-Heracleion, though the discovery itself is remarkable enough, but the whole arc of it, what the city was, how it functioned, why it mattered, how it sank, what it left behind, and what finding it has changed about how we understand the ancient world. Because finding a city this significant does not just add a new entry to the map. It rewrites things. It confirms things that were doubted. It complicates things that were considered settled. It fills in a gap in the story of how Egypt and Greece came to know each other, a gap that, before the year 2000, we did not even fully realise was there. Abu Qir Bay sits on the northwestern edge of the Nile Delta, northeast of the modern city of Alexandria. The coordinates place it at roughly 30 degrees north latitude, in a stretch of coastline that has changed considerably since antiquity. The delta itself is not a stable landform. It is built on accumulated river sediment, and it has been slowly subsiding, sinking, millimetre by millimetre, year by year, for thousands of years. The sea level has also changed. The combination of these two processes means that the coastline of ancient Egypt looked quite different from the coastline of today. Islands that existed in ancient times are now submerged. Channels that were navigable are now silted up or gone. The geography has shifted in ways that make it genuinely difficult to match ancient descriptions to modern maps. Thonis-Heracleion was built on what was at the time a fertile island in the Nile Delta, surrounded by waterways, accessible from the sea, positioned perfectly to serve as a gateway. To enter Egypt from the Mediterranean, you had to come through here. There was no bypassing it. It was the customs point, the inspection point, the religious threshold. You arrived at Thonis-Heracleion, you paid your taxes, you received whatever permissions you needed, and then you could proceed inland. It was, in the most literal sense, the entrance to Egypt. That position, that specific irreplaceable geographic role, is part of what made the city so significant for so long, and it is also, in a quiet way, part of what makes its disappearance so strange to think about. The entrance to Egypt, gone. Sitting on the bottom of a bay with its columns scattered and its statues lying face down in the silt, while the world above went on building new entrances and new cities, and eventually forgetting this one had ever existed. The ancient writers who mentioned it, Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, a few others, left behind just enough detail to make the city feel real without making it findable. A temple here, a harbour there, a story about Helen of Troy passing through, names, impressions, fragments, enough to know the city had existed, not enough to know where exactly it had gone. For a long time, that was all there was. Old words describing a place no one could locate, until someone decided to look in the water, and what they found there, the scale of it, the completeness of it, the sheer quantity of things that had survived, turned out to be far beyond what anyone had imagined. The city had not just left traces, it had left itself, whole, waiting. That is where we're going next, to the moment of discovery, to the slow and methodical process by which an entire city emerged from the seafloor, one stone at a time, into the light. But before we get to that moment, before the magnetometers and the sediment and the first stone emerging from the dark, it is worth spending some time with the written record. Because the discovery in the year 2000 did not happen in a vacuum. There were clues, old ones, scattered across texts written more than 2,000 years ago in Greek, by men who had either visited Egypt themselves or compiled the accounts of those who had. These texts were not secret. They had been sitting in libraries and archives and scholarly editions for centuries. The problem was never that the information was hidden. The problem was that the information was incomplete, and that no one had thought to look for the city in the water. Herodotus is the most famous of these witnesses. He was a Greek historian from Halicarnassus, born around 484 BCE, and he travelled extensively, through Greece, across Anatolia, into Egypt, along the Black Sea coast. He was, by his own account, an obsessive collector of stories and observations, and his great work, the Histories, is full of digressions about the places he visited and the things he was told. When he came to Egypt, probably around 450 BCE, he was clearly fascinated. He spent a significant portion of the histories writing about Egyptian customs, religion, geography and history, and he mentioned, almost in passing, a place he called Heracleion. He described a great temple of Heracles, which is to say, a temple the Greeks identified with their own hero Heracles, though the Egyptian deity in question was something rather different, located near one of the mouths of the Nile. He was not writing a guidebook. He was not trying to pin down coordinates. He mentioned the place because it was notable, because it had a temple worth remarking on, and then he moved on to other things. That is the nature of the ancient textual record. It is not systematic. It is not organised for the benefit of future archaeologists. Herodotus was writing for a Greek audience who were curious about Egypt, not for researchers 2,500 years later who would be trying to figure out where exactly a submerged city was. So his mention of Heracleion is useful, but it is not precise. It tells us the city existed and that it had a significant religious site. It does not tell us much more than that. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian writing in the 1st century BCE, also referenced the city. His account is somewhat more detailed in places, but it shares the same fundamental quality as Herodotus. It assumes the reader already knows where the place is, because in his time, presumably, people still did. He mentions the harbour, the temple, the city's role as an entry point into Egypt. He describes it as prosperous and well established. He's writing about a living city, or at least a city that was still present in the cultural memory of his era. By the time his texts were being copied and studied in medieval Europe, the city had been gone for centuries, and nobody thought to ask whether the harbour he described was perhaps sitting under the sea. There is also the matter of the name, or rather the names, plural. This is one of the more interesting details about Thonis-Heracleion, and it reflects something important about what the city actually was. Greek writers called it Heracleion or Heracleion. Egyptian records called it Thonis. These were not two different cities. They were two names for the same place, used by two different communities, who lived there side by side and apparently operated with a certain amount of parallel administrative identity. The Egyptian name Thonis appears in hieroglyphic inscriptions and official documents. The Greek name Heracleion appears in Greek texts and on Greek dedications. When scholars in the modern era were trying to figure out whether Thonis and Heracleion were the same place or different places, the answer, confirmed definitively only after the underwater excavations, was that they were one city with a dual identity, reflecting the dual nature of its population. This dual naming is not a trivial detail. It tells you something about the character of the place. Cities do not usually have two names in two different languages, unless two different cultural communities have enough presence there to each insist on their own version. Thonis-Heracleion was, from a relatively early period, a genuinely mixed city, Egyptian in its official religious and administrative life, but with a substantial and apparently long-established Greek population living under Egyptian law, conducting trade, maintaining their own small sanctuaries, and calling the city by a Greek name that reflected their own mythological framework. The Greeks identified the main temple with Heracles because the Egyptian deity worshipped there, a form of the god Amun, had characteristics they associated with their own hero. That kind of interpretive translation was common in the ancient world. You arrived in a foreign city, you saw a temple, you decided which of your own gods it most resembled, and you called it by that name. It was a way of making the foreign familiar. And in a port city where Greek merchants were arriving constantly, that kind of translation was probably happening all the time, in both directions. The city's role as a customs port is described in several ancient sources, and it is one of the details that seems almost too important to have been forgotten. Before Alexandria was founded in 331 BCE, Thonis-Heracleion was the primary, and for a significant period the mandatory point of entry into Egypt for ships coming from the Greek world. This was not an informal arrangement. It was official Egyptian policy. Foreign vessels, particularly Greek ones, were required to stop at Thonis-Heracleion before they could proceed into Egypt. They would be inspected, taxed and registered. The port had customs officials, tax collectors, harbour masters, and all the bureaucratic infrastructure that a major international entry point requires. It was, in essence, Egypt's front door to the Mediterranean world, and it was a door with a toll booth. One of the most striking pieces of documentary evidence for this role is a stele, a large inscribed stone slab known as the Stele of Naucratis. This stele was found at Naucratis, another ancient site in the Nile Delta, and it dates to the reign of Nectanebo I, who ruled Egypt from 380 to 362 BCE. The stele records a royal decree about taxes on trade goods, and it specifically mentions Thonis, the Egyptian name for the city, as the customs point for goods entering Egypt from the sea. A tenth of the value of all goods imported through Thonis was to be donated to the Temple of Neith at Sais. This was a formal legal document, inscribed in stone, issued by a pharaoh, naming the city explicitly in the context of its economic function. It is about as solid a piece of historical evidence as you can ask for. And yet, for centuries, the city it named had no confirmed physical location. The reason for this is not difficult to understand once you know what happened to the city. But before anyone knew it had sunk into the sea, the absence of the city from the archaeological record was genuinely puzzling. Egypt is one of the most extensively excavated countries in the world. Archaeologists have been working there since the 19th century, and in many cases far earlier. The major ancient sites, Luxor, Karnak, Memphis, Saqqara, Abydos, have been studied for generations. The Nile Delta, it is true, is more difficult to work in than Upper Egypt, because the wet, shifting sediment of the delta is not as well suited to preservation as the dry desert conditions further south. But the delta had been explored, Naucratis had been found, other delta sites had been identified. Why not Thonis-Heracleion? The answer, of course, is that everyone was looking in the wrong place. They were looking on land, because that is where cities are. That is the assumption that goes so deep it barely registers as an assumption at all. A city is a thing on land. You look for it by surveying the ground, by identifying surface features, by digging test trenches, by following ancient descriptions of roads and rivers. Nobody was systematically surveying the floor of Abu Qir Bay, because the floor of Abu Qir Bay was not, in the conventional understanding of things, where cities went. What is interesting in retrospect is how the ancient texts themselves contain hints that might have pointed toward the water. The descriptions of Thonis-Heracleion consistently emphasize its island character. It was surrounded by water, accessed by boat, positioned at the mouth of a Nile channel. Ancient writers describe arriving there by ship, not by road. The city was, even in its heyday, a place defined by water. It sat on an island in the delta surrounded by channels and lagoons. The transition from island city to submerged city was, geologically speaking, not a dramatic leap. It was a continuation of the same relationship with water that had always defined the place. The water was always there. Eventually it simply won. The tension in the historical record. This gap between a city that was clearly real, clearly important, clearly well documented and yet completely absent from the physical landscape, persisted for a remarkably long time. Scholars who worked on the ancient sources knew about Thonis-Heracleion. They debated its location. Some thought it might be buried under the silt of the delta. Some thought it might be somewhere that had not yet been excavated. A few speculated about the possibility of underwater remains, given what was known about the general subsidence of the delta coastline. But speculation is not the same as systematic investigation, and for most of the 20th century, the city remained in the category of things that were known to have existed but could not be confirmed or located. There is something almost melancholy about that situation if you think about it for a moment. A city that was, for several centuries, one of the most important ports in the Eastern Mediterranean. a place where pharaohs came to be legitimized, where thousands of merchants passed through every year, where Egyptian and Greek religious traditions intertwined in ways that shaped the cultural history of both civilizations. And for more than 1,000 years, it was just a name in old books. Scholars could read Herodotus's mention of the temple. They could study the stele of Naucratis and note the reference to Thonis. They could piece together a rough picture of what the city had been. But they could not go there. There was no there to go to, as far as anyone knew. The city existed only in language, only in the faded traces left by people who had seen it when it was still standing. That changed in the year 2000. But what the excavations revealed, the scale of what was down there, the completeness of it, the sheer quantity of objects and structures that had survived, gave those old texts a new kind of weight. When Herodotus mentioned the Temple of Heracles, he was not writing mythology. He was writing from observation, or from the observations of people he trusted. When the stele of Naucratis named Thonis as the customs port, it was describing a real place with real harbour infrastructure, real tax officials, real ships coming and going. The underwater discoveries did not just find the city. They confirmed the accuracy of sources that had been, in some corners of scholarship, treated with mild scepticism. They turned old words back into physical reality, and that is part of what makes the story of Thonis-Heracleion unusual among archaeological discoveries. It is not just the story of finding something that was lost. It is the story of a long, slow process by which a real place gradually became uncertain, first economically overshadowed, then geologically swallowed, then historically doubted, and then, after more than 1,000 years, found again, not in fragments, not in traces, but in something much closer to its whole self, preserved under the water that took it. The city that Herodotus visited around 450 BCE, the city named on Nectanebo's stele, the city that Greek merchants passed through on their way into Egypt, that city is still there. Its columns are scattered on the seafloor, its statues are lying in the silt, its anchors are still resting where ships left them. The inscription on the stele is still legible. The written record and the physical record, separated for so long, have finally found each other again. Now we need to talk about how that reunion happened, about the man who decided to look in the water and what his team found when they did. Frank Goddio is not a name that appears in most general histories of archaeology, but among people who work in underwater excavation, he occupies a particular kind of position. He is French, born in 1947, and he came to underwater archaeology through an unusual route. He had a background in mathematics and statistics, and worked for years in international economic development before turning his attention to the sea. That combination of analytical training and genuine curiosity about the ancient world shaped the way he approached his work. He was not someone who dug with a romantic notion of treasure hunting. He was someone who thought carefully about how to find things that other people had not found, and who was willing to build the methodological tools necessary to do that. He founded the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, known by its French acronym IEASM, in 1987. The institute was built around the idea that underwater excavation, done properly, required the same rigour and patience as any terrestrial dig, but also required specialised equipment, specialised training, and a willingness to work slowly in conditions that are genuinely difficult. Before he turned his attention to Abu Qir, Goddio had already made several significant finds. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, he located the wrecks of ships from Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of the Nile, sunk by the British in 1798 in, as it happens, Abu Qir Bay itself. He also found the San Diego, a Spanish galleon that sank in the Philippines in 1600, and excavated it over several seasons, recovering thousands of artifacts and producing detailed documentation of the wreck. These projects established both his reputation and his methodology. The the methodology mattered enormously for what came next. Godio's approach to underwater survey relied heavily on remote sensing technology rather than on divers simply swimming around and looking for things. The seafloor of Abu Qir Bay is not particularly clear water, it is shallow, in the relevant areas, somewhere between 4 and 9 meters deep. But the visibility is often poor and the sediment is thick. You cannot simply dive in and see an ancient city. The silt covers everything. What you can do, with the right instruments, is detect anomalies in the sediment, variations in density, in composition, in the magnetic signature of buried objects, and use those readings to build a picture of what lies beneath the surface before you ever send a diver down. The primary tools Godio's team used in Abu Qir Bay were nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometers and sub-bottom profilers. The magnetometers detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the presence of ferrous materials, iron, certain types of stone, objects with particular mineral compositions. When you tow a magnetometer across the seafloor, you get a map of magnetic anomalies, and those anomalies can indicate the presence of buried structures or objects. The sub-bottom profilers work differently. They send acoustic signals into the sediment and measure how those signals reflect back, allowing the team to see layered structures beneath the surface, almost like a rough geological cross-section. Together, these instruments allowed Godio's team to survey large areas of the bay floor systematically, without disturbing the sediment, and to identify areas worth investigating more closely. The survey of Abu Qir Bay had actually begun before 2000. Godio and his team had been working in the bay since the mid-1990s, partly following up on the Napoleonic fleet work, and partly beginning a broader investigation of the ancient underwater landscape of the area. There had already been some indication that there were significant ancient remains in the bay. Local fishermen had occasionally brought up fragments of ancient objects in their nets, and there were scattered historical references to the possibility of submerged sites in the region. But the systematic survey work that began to reveal the true extent of what was down there was a gradual process, not a single moment of revelation. The year 2000 is often cited as the discovery date, and in a formal sense it is. That is when the team's work in the bay produced findings significant enough to announce publicly, and when the identification of the site as Thonis-Heracleion became supportable. But the experience of finding the city was not, by any account, a sudden dramatic moment. It was more like a slow accumulation of evidence reaching a point where the conclusion became unavoidable. The magnetometer surveys had been returning anomalies across a large area of the bay floor. When divers went down to investigate specific anomalies, they began finding things. Not all at once, and not in a way that immediately announced itself as a lost city. First there were fragments of worked stone, then larger pieces, then something that resolved, as the silt was carefully cleared, into a carved surface, an inscription. That inscription was on a stele, a large upright stone slab used in the ancient world to carry official texts, decrees, and dedications. When the stele was carefully documented and eventually raised, it turned out to be a tax decree, a formal administrative text referencing the city of Thonis. It was not identical to any known inscription, but it closely matched the content and formula of the Stele of Nocrates, another tax decree that had been found on land decades earlier, and that also referenced Thonis-Heracleion. The discovery of this stele was significant not just because it was an artifact, but because it was a named artifact. It carried a specific reference to a specific place. It was, in a sense, the city identifying itself. After the stele, things began to accumulate. More stone structures, columns lying on the seafloor, their drums scattered but still roughly aligned with their original positions, because when they fell into soft sediment that cushioned them and held them in place. Walls, paved surfaces, the outlines visible through careful survey work of what appeared to be a canal system, channels cut through the ancient land surface, now preserved as depressions in the seafloor, and statues. Several large statues lying in the silt, their features still visible, their surfaces protected by the fine sediment that had settled over them over the course of centuries. The statues were among the most striking early finds, both because of their size and because of their condition. One was a colossal figure, over 5 meters tall, representing Hapi, the god of the annual Nile flood, the deity associated with fertility and abundance. Hapi is typically depicted as a figure with a rounded belly and pendulous breasts, representing the generative fullness of the flood, and this statue followed that iconographic tradition at a scale that was genuinely imposing. It was found lying on the seafloor, broken at the waist, but both halves were present and the surface detail was well preserved. Another large statue depicted a pharaoh, and a third a queen or goddess, the three together forming what appeared to be a monumental group that had once stood, most likely in or near the main temple of the city. There was also a large pink granite stele, later identified as belonging to the reign of Nectanebo I, who ruled Egypt from roughly 380 to 362 BCE. This stele was nearly 2 meters tall and carried a formal inscription, a royal decree concerning taxation and religious offerings at the temple. The fact that it named Thonis and its temple directly, and that it matched in content and formula the stele of Naucrates found at a different site, was important corroborating evidence. The two decrees appeared to be companion pieces, issued simultaneously, one posted at Naucratis and one at Thonis-Heracleion, both laying out the same administrative arrangements. Finding the second stele in the bay was not just an archaeological discovery. It was a confirmation that the site was what the team believed it to be. What the team was beginning to understand, by the time these early finds had been catalogued and studied, was that they were not looking at a small settlement or a minor outpost. The anomalies in the magnetometer surveys extended across a very large area. The structures on the seafloor were not scattered ruins, but the remnants of an organised urban layout. Streets, basins, buildings arranged around a central complex. The harbour area, which was becoming clearer through this sub-bottom profiling work, appeared to have been substantial, with multiple anchorage zones and a system of canals connecting the harbour to the interior of the city. The scale of what was down there was, as Gaudio and his colleagues began to appreciate, genuinely large. This was not a village. This was a city. The coordinates of the site place it roughly 6.5 kilometres off the modern Egyptian coast, in the northeastern part of Abu Qir Bay, at approximately 30 degrees north latitude. The water depth over the site ranges from about 4 to 9 metres, shallow enough to dive on without specialised deep water equipment, but deep enough that the site had remained effectively invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The bay is not heavily trafficked by research vessels, and for most of its modern history it had been thought of primarily as a fishing ground, and, historically, as the site of the Napoleonic naval battle. The idea that a major ancient city lay beneath it had not been a working hypothesis for most archaeologists. What made the discovery feel significant beyond the immediate excitement of finding large and well-preserved artefacts was the growing sense of what it implied about the completeness of the site. On land, ancient cities are almost always heavily disturbed. They have been built over, quarried for stone, ploughed through, dug into by later inhabitants and by earlier archaeologists. The physical record is fragmentary almost by definition. What Gaudio's team was finding in Abu Qir Bay was different. The sediment had not just covered the city. In many areas, it had sealed it. The fine silt of the Nile Delta, settling slowly over the submerged structures across centuries, had acted as a kind of accidental preservation medium. Objects that would have been scavenged or decomposed on land had survived underwater. Organic materials, wood, rope, plant residue inside ceramic vessels, were present in conditions that would be impossible in a terrestrial context. The city had not been stripped, it had been buried. That realization took some time to fully absorb. Archaeologists working on the site in the years after 2000 kept encountering things that, by any reasonable expectation, should not still exist. Bronze objects in excellent condition. gold jewellery, ceramics with their contents still partially preserved, the wood of ancient ships still holding its shape in the sediment, the sheer quantity of anchors, eventually totalling more than 700, lying in the harbour area, abandoned by ships that had been moored there when the city finally went under. Each new season of excavation added to the picture, and the picture kept getting larger and more detailed. The emotional register of all this, as described by Gaudio and his colleagues in various interviews and publications, is worth pausing on for a moment. It was not the kind of discovery that arrives in a single overwhelming instant. It was cumulative. Each dive, each survey pass, each artifact carefully documented and raised, added another piece to a picture that kept growing. The team knew, fairly early on, that they had found something significant. But the full weight of what they had found, a complete ancient city, largely intact, sitting on the floor of a shallow bay off the Egyptian coast, settled in gradually over seasons of work. There is something fitting about that, given the nature of the city itself. Thonis-Heracleion did not disappear overnight, and it was not found overnight either. What the team had on their hands by the time the initial surveys and early excavations had been completed and assessed was a site of extraordinary complexity and richness. The central island of the ancient city, with the grand temple of Amun-Gereb at its heart, was identifiable. The harbour basins were mappable. The canal network could be traced. The distribution of artefacts across the site was beginning to suggest the different functional zones of the city: religious areas, commercial areas, residential areas, harbour infrastructure. A picture of an actual functioning ancient city was emerging from the sediment, slowly and methodically, the way the city itself had slowly and methodically sunk into it. And there was still, as the team was well aware, an enormous amount left to find. The survey suggested that the site extended across roughly 110 square kilometres of the bay floor, an area so large that even decades of systematic excavation would cover only a fraction of it. The question was not whether there was more to find. The question was what exactly was down there, and what it could tell us about a city that had been for so long little more than a name in old books. To begin to answer that question, it helps to understand what Thonis-Heracleion actually was at its height, not just as a name or a location, but as a living place. What happened there, who came through its harbour, what they traded, what they believed, what they built. Because the city that Gaudio's team found on the seafloor was not just a collection of ruins. It was the physical record of several centuries of one of the most important ports in the ancient Mediterranean world. And that record, as the excavations would reveal, was far more detailed and far more surprising than anyone had expected. So let us try to picture it. Not as a ruin, not as a field of scattered stones on a seafloor, but as it was. A city. A working, populated, commercially active ancient city sitting at the mouth of the Nile, with ships coming and going, with priests moving through temple courtyards, with merchants arguing over weights and measures, with the smell of salt water and river silt and whatever was being traded that season. That city is still down there, in the sense that its physical substance never went anywhere. The columns are still where they fell, the anchors are still where they were dropped, the statues are still in the sediment, waiting. And the surveys and excavations that Gaudio's team has conducted across more than 2 decades of work have given us, piece by piece, a sense of just how much is there. The site covers approximately 110 square kilometres of the floor of Abu Qir Bay. That is a large number, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. 110 square kilometres of submerged urban geography. To put it in some kind of proportion, that is roughly the size of a mid-sized modern city district spread across the shallow bay floor at depths ranging from about 4 to 9 metres. Not all of that area is densely packed with structures, of course. Ancient cities, like modern ones, had open spaces, waterways and areas of lower density. But across that entire zone, the surveys have detected anomalies, structures, concentrations of artefacts, and buried architectural remains. The The site is genuinely enormous. At the centre of it, or at least at what was the centre of the ancient city, there was an island. The main inhabited core of Thonis-Heracleion was built on a raised area surrounded by canals and water channels, a configuration that was not unusual for settlements in the Nile Delta, where the landscape was never entirely solid to begin with. The delta is a place of water as much as land, a shifting, flood-prone, canal-threaded environment where the boundary between river and ground was always somewhat negotiable. Building a city there meant building with water in mind, and Thonis-Heracleion clearly did that. Its canal network was not incidental. It was the city's circulatory system, connecting the harbour basins to the interior, allowing goods to move from ships directly into the commercial and religious heart of the settlement. The harbour itself was substantial. Over the course of excavations, the team identified multiple anchorage zones, different areas where different types of vessels would have moored, depending on their size and purpose. This was not a single key. It was a complex port infrastructure, with channels deep enough for large cargo vessels and shallower areas for smaller craft. The scale of the anchoring activity that took place here over the city's centuries of operation is suggested by one remarkable number. More than 700 ancient anchors have been recovered or documented in the harbour area. 700. That is not a quiet backwater. That is a place where ships arrived constantly, where the harbour was always at least partially full, where the business of maritime trade was an uninterrupted daily reality, and the ships themselves. 64 ancient vessels have been identified in the harbour area so far, a number that makes this one of the largest concentrations of ancient shipwrecks found anywhere in the world, and they were not found scattered randomly. They were found in configurations that suggest they sank where they were moored, or in areas associated with the harbour's active use. Some are small trading boats. Some appear to be larger cargo vessels. One has been identified as a ceremonial craft, a larger vessel likely used for religious processions on the water, which were an important part of Egyptian religious life. The anchors are mostly made of lead, which preserved well in the sediment. The wood of the ship survived in varying conditions, some hulls still holding recognisable form, others reduced to fragments, but fragments that could still be dated and analysed. The central island, rising slightly above the surrounding canal network, was dominated by the grand temple of Amun-Gereb. Amun-Gereb was a specific manifestation of the god Amun, associated with fertility and the flooding of the Nile, and the temple built in his honour here was not a modest structure. When the city was at its height, this would have been one of the most important religious buildings in northern Egypt. Its walls and columns have collapsed. The sediment around the site is partly composed of the debris of that collapse, but the scale of the fallen stonework gives a sense of what the building originally was. Massive column drums, sections of wall, architectural fragments spread across the seafloor in a pattern that archaeologists can use to reconstruct, at least partially, the original structure. Around and within the temple precinct, the finds have been extraordinary. Several large statues were discovered in the area of the temple, including 3 that stand out for their size and condition. A colossal figure of the god Hapi, the personification of the Nile's annual flood, depicted as a large, rounded figure associated with abundance and fertility, was found measuring approximately 5.4 metres in height. This is a genuinely imposing piece of sculpture. Alongside it, a statue of a pharaoh and a statue of a queen, both also of substantial size, were recovered from the same general area. These 3 figures are now among the most recognisable objects from the site, and they have been displayed in museum exhibitions around the world. But finding them was not a matter of simply spotting them on the seafloor. They had to be located through survey, carefully documented in situ, and then raised with considerable technical effort. Each one weighed several tons. There were also sphinxes. Smaller than the colossal figures but still significant, sphinx statues were found in the temple precinct, arranged in a configuration consistent with processional avenues, the kind of sphinx-lined pathway that was common in Egyptian temple architecture. The fact that even this level of spatial organisation is still readable in the underwater site after 2,000 years of submersion speaks to how well the sediment preserved the general layout of the city. The pink granite stele of Nectanebo I is one of the most historically significant single objects found at the site. Nectanebo I was a pharaoh of the 30th dynasty, ruling from roughly 380 to 362 BCE, and this stele, a large inscribed stone slab, bears a decree relating to taxation and the collection of duties at the port. The stele is 1.9 metres tall and is remarkably well preserved. It was found lying on the seafloor in the sediment near the temple precinct, and its inscription is still largely legible. This is the kind of object that makes historians genuinely excited, because it is not just an artifact, it is a document, a primary source, a piece of writing from the actual city, in the actual city, that can be read and interpreted and compared to other texts from the same period. The information it contains about the administrative and economic function of Thonis-Heracleion is directly useful to scholars working on the history of late-period Egypt. Beyond the monumental objects, the statues, the stelae, the architectural remains, the site has yielded an enormous quantity of smaller finds. Bronze ritual objects, including a bronze statue of a pharaoh that stands approximately 2 meters tall, were recovered from the temple area. This figure is in remarkable condition. Its surface details are still clearly visible. It would have been a significant religious object in the temple's active life, and it has survived better underwater than it almost certainly would have on land, where bronze objects were frequently melted down and reused across the centuries. Gold jewellery has been found at the site, rings and earrings and other small objects, the kind of personal adornment that tells you about the people who lived and worked here, not just the official religious and political life of the city. Ceramic vessels, many of them intact, have been recovered from various areas of the site. Some of these vessels still contain traces of organic material, residues of whatever they once held, whether food, wine, oil, or ritual substances. The ability to analyse those residues chemically gives researchers information about trade goods and consumption patterns that would be impossible to obtain from an empty pot. Hundreds of smaller votive objects were found in and around the temple precinct. Bronze figurines of gods, faience amulets, small objects left as offerings by worshippers. These are the everyday material of ancient religious practice, the things that ordinary people brought to the temple, and they survive here in numbers and conditions that are rare in the archaeological record. Faience, the glazed ceramic material used widely in ancient Egypt for small objects and jewellery, is fragile and tends not to survive well in disturbed contexts. In the fine silt of Abu Qir Bay, it has survived very well. The sediment itself is worth describing, because it is such an important part of why any of this exists to be found. The Nile Delta deposits extremely fine-grained silt, the kind of material that settles slowly and thoroughly, filling in spaces and sealing surfaces. When the city sank, the sediment continued to accumulate over it, layer by layer, creating a protective blanket that is in some areas several meters deep above the ancient surfaces. This is not the coarse sand of a beach or the rocky rubble of a collapsed building. It is dense, fine, almost airless silt that limits the biological activity, the bacteria, the boring organisms, the chemical processes that would normally break down organic material. Wood survives in it, rope survives in it, plant material survives in it. The conditions are, from an archaeological perspective, almost unusually good. That said, working in this sediment is not easy. Excavating underwater in fine silt means that every movement of a diver or a tool creates clouds of suspended particles that reduce visibility to near zero. The work requires careful water dredging, slow, methodical clearing, and constant attention to the fragility of what is being uncovered. Objects that have been stable in the sediment for 2,000 years can be damaged by an abrupt change in pressure or temperature, by exposure to light, or simply by being moved too quickly. The conservation challenges associated with objects raised from this kind of environment are substantial. Materials that are stable underwater can deteriorate rapidly once removed from their conditions of preservation, and the logistics of treating and stabilizing large quantities of waterlogged objects, bronze, ceramic, wood, gold, faience, require significant resources and expertise. What the sediment preserved then is not just a collection of individual objects. It preserved the spatial relationships between those objects. The fact that this anchor was here, that statue was there, these ceramics were in this area and those bronze objects were in that one. In archaeology, context is often as important as the object itself. Knowing where something was found, what it was found with, what layer it came from. This information is frequently more valuable than the object in isolation, because it allows you to reconstruct the activity that put the object there. In a site like Thonis-Heracleion, where the context has been preserved along with the objects, the interpretive potential is genuinely unusual. The distribution of finds across the site has allowed the team to begin mapping the functional zones of the ancient city with some confidence. The religious core around the temple of Amun-Gereb is distinct from the harbour area, which is distinct from zones that appear to have been more commercially or residentially oriented. The canal network that connected these zones is traceable. The overall shape of the city, an island settlement with a major temple at its centre, surrounded by water channels and harbour infrastructure, is becoming clearer with each season of work, and the numbers keep growing. More than 700 anchors, 64 ships, 3 colossal statues, hundreds of bronze objects, gold jewellery, a 2-metre bronze pharaoh, a legible royal stele, ceramic vessels with their contents still partially intact, sphinxes still in processional alignment. These are not the scattered fragments of a site that barely survived. This is, in a very real sense, a preserved city, incomplete certainly, still largely unexcavated definitely, but preserved in a way that land sites almost never are, and rich with information about the people who built it and used it and eventually gradually left it to the water. The question that all of this physical evidence naturally raises is the one that the next part of the story has to address. Not what is there. We are beginning to understand that. But what was it for? What did this city actually do, at the height of its importance, and why did it matter so much to so many different people? Egyptians, Greeks, traders, priests, pharaohs, merchants, that they built something this large and this elaborate at the edge of the Nile Delta, at the threshold between the river and the sea? The answer to that question is not just about trade routes and tax collection, though those are part of it. It is about what this city represented, religiously and politically, in the world of the ancient Mediterranean. And that is a story worth telling carefully. To understand what Thonis-Heracleion actually was, not just as a collection of objects on a seafloor, but as a living city, you have to think about geography. Not the geography of the modern coast, where Abu Sir Bay is a quiet stretch of water east of Alexandria, but the geography of the ancient Nile Delta as it existed 2,500 years ago. The delta was a different place then. It was wider, wetter, more complex. A web of distributaries, branches of the Nile, spread out across a broad flat plain before reaching the sea, and at the point where several of those channels converge near the coast, where the river finally gave way to the Mediterranean, there was a natural choke point, a place where any ship coming from the sea had to stop before it could enter Egypt proper. Thonis-Heracleion sat at that choke point. This was not an accident of settlement. The city did not grow up there simply because the land was pleasant or the fishing was good. It was positioned deliberately, or at least recognised early as the place that controlled access. Every foreign vessel arriving in Egypt from the Greek world, from the Aegean, from the Eastern Mediterranean, every ship carrying wine or silver or olive oil or timber, had to pass through Thonis-Heracleion before it could go anywhere else. This was the law. The decree of Naucratis, a royal stele found in pieces at the site and now largely reconstructed, makes this explicit. It states that the customs port for goods arriving from the sea is Thonis-Heracleion, and that a 10% tax on imports and exports is to be collected there, with a portion of those revenues directed to the temple of Neith at Say. The decree is not a suggestion. It is a royal command inscribed in stone, meant to be permanent and public. What this means in practical terms is that Thonis-Heracleion was the financial gateway to Egypt. If you were a Greek merchant in the 7th or 6th century BCE, and you had loaded your ship with amphoras of wine from Chios, or bronze vessels from Corinth, and you were heading for the wealthy markets of Egypt, your first stop was here. Your cargo was inspected. A portion of its value was assessed. The tax was collected. Only then were you permitted to continue upriver, or to trade within the city itself, or to move on to other Egyptian ports. The city was, in the most literal sense, where Egypt met the outside world and decided what to let in. The scale of that function is difficult to fully picture, but the archaeological evidence gives some sense of it. Over 700 anchors found in the harbour area alone. That is not a small number of ships passing through occasionally. That is evidence of sustained, heavy, continuous maritime traffic over a long period. 64 ancient vessels on the harbour floor, some of which were trading boats, some ceremonial, some possibly warships, representing centuries of maritime activity at this single location. The harbour infrastructure that the survey has revealed includes multiple anchorage basins, canal connections, and what appear to be loading and unloading areas along the waterfront. This was a working port in the fullest sense, busy, organised, and commercially vital. The tax collection itself would have required a substantial administrative apparatus, officials to assess cargo values, scribes to record transactions, guards to enforce compliance, storage facilities for goods awaiting inspection or transit. There would have been translators, because Greek merchants did not necessarily speak Egyptian, and Egyptian customs officials did not necessarily speak Greek. There would have been money changers, because foreign coins had to be converted or assessed against Egyptian standards of value. There would have been warehouses, inns, food stalls, and all the other infrastructure that grows up around a busy port wherever you find one, in any era. The city at its peak was not a quiet religious settlement or a small administrative outpost. It was a loud, active, commercially intense place where people from very different backgrounds were constantly doing business with each other. The Greek presence in the city is worth dwelling on, because it reflects something important about how the ancient world actually worked. Greeks had been trading with Egypt since at least the 7th century BCE, and by the time Thonis-Heracleion was at its height, there was a substantial and permanent Greek community living within the city. The decree of Naucratis describes a designated area, a Greek quarter, where foreign merchants were permitted to live and conduct business under Egyptian law. This was not unusual in the ancient world. Many ports had such arrangements, where foreign traders were permitted to reside but within defined zones and under specific legal frameworks. What is interesting here is the physical evidence for that arrangement, which the excavation has begun to reveal. Greek pottery found in specific zones of the site, Greek coins, small Greek-style sanctuaries, objects associated with Greek religious practice, including figurines of Aphrodite, found alongside Egyptian religious objects in ways that suggest not just coexistence, but some degree of genuine interaction. The city had 2 names, and that fact alone says something. To Egyptians it was Thonis. To Greeks it was Heracleion, the city of Heracles. The Greeks had a habit of identifying foreign gods with their own equivalents, a practice scholars sometimes call interpretatio Graeca, and in this case they appear to have associated the Egyptian god worshipped at the main temple with Heracles, the Greek hero god of strength and travel. Why Heracles specifically is not entirely clear, but the identification stuck, and the Greek name for the city persisted alongside the Egyptian one for centuries. Having 2 names in 2 languages is not just a linguistic curiosity. It reflects the reality of a place where two populations, two legal systems, two religious traditions, and two commercial networks overlapped on a daily basis. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt around 450 BCE and whose accounts of the country remain one of our most detailed ancient sources, mentions the sanctuary of Heracles at Thonis-Heracleion. He also tells a story about the city that is, depending on your perspective, either a fascinating mythological detail or a quietly amusing example of ancient reputation management. According to Herodotus, Helen of Troy, the famous Helen, whose abduction by Paris supposedly triggered the Trojan War, was brought to Thonis-Heracleion by Paris on their way from Sparta to Troy. The local governor, a man named Thonis, reportedly refused to allow Paris to continue his journey until the matter was properly reported to the pharaoh. Helen, in this version of the story, was held in Egypt for the duration of the war, and the Greeks who sailed to Troy were fighting over a phantom, a ghost image of Helen, while the real woman waited safely in Egypt. Herodotus says he heard this story from Egyptian priests and found it more plausible than the Homeric version. Whether or not you believe any part of that story, its existence in the historical record tells you something. It tells you that Thonis-Heracleion was famous enough and important enough that ancient storytellers chose to set significant events there. Cities that are merely functional do not tend to attract mythology. The fact that this city accumulated legendary associations with Heracles, with Helen, with the great customs port where even the most famous travellers had to stop and account for themselves, suggests that he occupied a particular place in the ancient imagination. It was a threshold, a place between worlds, between the sea and the river, between Egypt and everywhere else, between one civilization and another. The religious dimension of the city was inseparable from its commercial and political functions. The great temple of Amun-Gereb at the city's centre was not simply a place of worship in the way a modern person might think of a church or a mosque, a separate sphere of life, distinct from business and politics. In ancient Egypt, the temple was the economic, political and spiritual core of a settlement simultaneously. The god owned the land around the temple. The god received a portion of the taxes. The god's blessing was required for the legitimacy of the pharaoh himself, and at Thonis-Heracleion this last point was particularly significant. There is evidence drawn from texts and from the votive objects found at the site that pharaohs came to the temple of Amun-Gereb specifically to receive divine legitimation before assuming the full authority of their kingship. The connection between the temple and royal power was not merely symbolic, it was constitutional in the ancient Egyptian sense. A pharaoh who had not been recognized by Amun at this temple was, in some meaningful sense, not yet fully a pharaoh. This gave the city a political importance that went beyond its role as a customs port. It was not just where foreign goods entered Egypt. It was, in a certain sense, where Egyptian kings entered their kingship. The stele of Nectanebo I, found at the site and dated to around 380 BCE, is one of the most direct pieces of evidence we have for the city's official importance in the late period. Nectanebo I was the founder of the 30th dynasty, the last native Egyptian dynasty before the Persian reconquest, and then the arrival of Alexander the Great. His decree, inscribed on the stele, establishes the tax arrangements for the port and directs revenues to the temple. The fact that he chose to inscribe this decree at Thonis-Heracleion and that the stele was erected at the temple tells you that the city was still very much at the centre of Egyptian official life in the 4th century BCE. It was not yet declining. It was still the place where the state made its formal arrangements with the gods and with commerce simultaneously. The late period, roughly 664 to 332 BCE, is the era during which Thonis-Heracleion was most intensely active. This was a complicated time in Egyptian history, a period of Persian invasions, brief recoveries of independence, and increasing contact with the Greek world. The Persians occupied Egypt twice during this period, and their administration would have used the customs port just as the native pharaohs did, because the practical need for a controlled entry point did not change with the identity of the ruler. Trade continued, ships continued to arrive, the taxes continued to be collected, the temple continued to function. The city was, in this sense, more durable than any particular dynasty or foreign occupier. It outlasted them all, at least for a while. The connection to the Persian period raises an interesting point about the city's resilience. When foreign powers occupied Egypt, they tended to work through existing institutions rather than dismantling them, at least initially. The Temple of Amun-Gereb was too important, too deeply embedded in the religious and commercial life of the country, to simply shut down. Even the Persians, who were not enthusiastic supporters of Egyptian religious traditions in general, appear to have left the major temples functioning. The city continued, the port continued, the priests continued their ceremonies, and the Greek merchants continued to arrive and pay their taxes and load their ships with Egyptian goods. Life at Thonis-Heracleion had a kind of institutional momentum that kept it going through political upheavals that destroyed other places entirely. What the annual religious calendar looked like in this city is something the excavation has begun to illuminate. The mysteries of Osiris, a major religious festival celebrated across Egypt in the month of Khoiak, roughly our November, involved elaborate boat processions, ritual ceremonies and public celebrations. At Thonis-Heracleion, evidence for this festival has been found in the form of small votive barks, model boats, some of them quite finely made, discovered in the temple precinct and in the surrounding waters. These were not decorative objects, they were ritual objects, used in the festival ceremonies and then deposited in the sacred waters around the temple as offerings. Finding them in the sediment around the temple, still in the general area where they were placed 2,000 years ago, gives a quiet kind of weight to the evidence. The festival happened here. People carried these boats, they lowered them into the water, and then the water kept them. Greek visitors to the city may have observed or participated in these ceremonies. The presence of Greek religious objects alongside Egyptian ones in the same zones of the site suggests that the boundary between Greek and Egyptian religious practice was not always sharply maintained. This is not surprising historically. When people live and trade alongside each other for generations, their religious lives tend to overlap in informal ways, even when the official traditions remain distinct. A Greek merchant who spent months in Thonis-Heracleion every year, who knew the priests, who did business in the shadow of the great temple, might well have left a small offering at the Egyptian shrine, not because he had converted to Egyptian religion, but simply because it was the done thing, because it was polite, because the god of this place deserved acknowledgement. These small acts of practical religious respect are almost invisible in the historical record, but they leave traces in the archaeological one. The picture that emerges from all of this, the tax decrees, the harbour infrastructure, the temple ceremonies, the Greek quarter, the royal legitimation rituals, the 700 anchors, is of a city that was genuinely at the centre of things for several centuries, not a backwater, not a minor regional port, a place that mattered to the Egyptian state, to the Greek commercial world, to the religious calendar of the country, and to the political legitimacy of the pharaohs themselves. A place where, on any given day, you might have found Egyptian priests preparing for a festival, Greek merchants arguing over the assessed value of their cargo, royal scribes recording tax receipts, sailors from half a dozen different places repairing their ships in the harbour, and pilgrims arriving to pay their respects at the Temple of Amun-Gereb before continuing their journey upriver. That is the city that sank. Not a small settlement, not an outpost, not a place that history had already forgotten before the water took it. A city at the height of its importance and complexity, still functioning, still central, still inhabited by people going about the full range of human activity. The question of how something like that disappears, not just from the surface of the earth, but from memory, from maps, from the knowledge of every subsequent generation, requires understanding what the ground beneath it was actually doing, slowly and quietly, over the centuries when the city was still alive. To understand what happened to Thonis-Heracleion, you have to start with the ground itself, not with politics, not with trade routes, not with the rise of Alexandria. You have to start with the earth beneath the city, because that is where the answer actually lives. The Nile Delta is not solid land in the way that most people imagine land to be. It is, in geological terms, a young and unstable formation, a vast accumulation of sediment deposited over millions of years by the Nile as it spread toward the Mediterranean. The material that makes up the delta is not bedrock or compacted stone. It is layers of silt, clay, sand, and organic matter, stacked and compressed over time but never truly firm. It is the kind of ground that holds water within it, that shifts under pressure, that responds to disturbance in ways that harder ground would not. Building a city on the Nile Delta, in ancient times, was not building on solid earth. It was building on a very large, very slowly moving deposit of river sediment that happened to be above sea level. For a while, the process that geologists call liquefaction is one of the more unsettling things that can happen to ground that looks perfectly stable. Under normal conditions, the sediment of the Nile Delta is firm enough to walk on, to build on, to anchor a harbour to. But when that sediment is subjected to significant stress, a strong earthquake, for example, or rapid loading from heavy structures, or prolonged saturation, it can behave more like a liquid than a solid. The water trapped between the sediment particles is forced upward under pressure, and the ground loses its ability to support weight. Things that were resting on the surface begin to sink. Walls tilt. Foundations shift. Heavy stone structures that had stood for centuries can drop several meters in a very short period of time. The IIEASM geological studies of Abu Qir Bay found clear evidence of this process beneath the ruins of Thonis-Heracleion. The layers of sediment under the city show signs of repeated liquefaction events, zones where the material collapsed inward, where the normal stratigraphy is disturbed, where the ground simply gave way at some point and took everything above it with it. Earthquakes are the most likely trigger for major liquefaction events in this region. The eastern Mediterranean is seismically active. Egypt sits near the boundary of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, and the region has a documented history of significant earthquakes going back thousands of years. A strong enough seismic event striking the Nile Delta would not need to be directly beneath Thonis-Heracleion to cause serious damage. The shaking alone, transmitted through the water-saturated sediment, would be enough to destabilize the ground under the city's heavier structures, the temple, the harbour walls, the large stone platforms and quays. Once the sediment began to liquefy under those structures, the sinking would follow quickly. Not necessarily all at once, and not necessarily completely, but enough to begin the process of submersion that would eventually place the entire city underwater. There is also the matter of land subsidence, which operates on a much slower timescale but is no less consequential. The Nile Delta as a whole has been sinking for a very long time. The weight of the sediment itself causes the deeper layers to compact gradually. The natural processes of the delta, the annual flooding, the deposition of new material, the slow settling of older layers, all contribute to a gradual downward movement of the surface. Measurements in the modern Nile Delta suggest subsidence rates of roughly 1 to 5 millimeters per year in different parts of the region, depending on local geology and human activity. That sounds like almost nothing, but over 500 years, even at the lower end of that range, it adds up to half a metre or more of vertical drop. Over 1,000 years, the numbers become significant enough to matter enormously for a city built near sea level. Thonis-Heracleion was built on low ground, close to the water, because that is where a port has to be. The combination of its coastal location and the ongoing subsidence of the delta beneath it meant that the city was always, in a geological sense, on borrowed time. Rising sea levels added another layer of pressure. After the classical period, sea levels in the Mediterranean rose gradually, and the combination of rising water from above and sinking ground from below is a particularly effective way to submerge a coastal settlement. The city did not need a single catastrophic flood to disappear. It needed the slow, patient work of geology and hydrology, operating over centuries, punctuated occasionally by sharper events like earthquakes that accelerated the process in specific areas. What the archaeological evidence suggests is that the submersion of Thonis-Heracleion was not a single event. It was a process. Different parts of the city likely sank at different times, at different rates, in response to different combinations of these forces. The harbour area, with its heavy stone quays and massive anchors, and the accumulated weight of centuries of maritime infrastructure, may have been particularly vulnerable to liquefaction. The temple precinct, built on a central island with heavy stone construction, would have been subject to both the weight-induced settling and the seismic shaking that could trigger rapid sinking. Residential and commercial areas built of lighter materials might have survived longer, slowly flooding as the water level rose around them rather than sinking dramatically in a single event. The geological team working with Godio's excavation found evidence of what they describe as a collapsed sediment layer beneath the main structures of the city, a zone where the ground essentially failed, dropping the buildings and streets above it downward into the softer material below. This kind of collapse can happen relatively quickly in geological terms, meaning over years or decades rather than centuries, but it is still not the kind of sudden overnight catastrophe that dramatic retellings sometimes imagine. The people living in Thonis-Heracleion would have had some awareness that things were going wrong. Buildings that began to tilt, streets that flooded more frequently than they used to, harbour walls that required constant repair, the slow encroachment of water into areas that had previously been dry. This is not a story of a city that went to sleep one night and woke up under the sea. It is a story of a city that gradually became uninhabitable, over a period that may have stretched across several generations, as the ground beneath it quietly gave way. One thing that makes this particularly interesting is the way the sinking actually helped preserve what it destroyed. When the buildings of Thonis-Heracleion collapsed into the softer delta sediment, they were quickly covered by silt. The same fine, oxygen-poor material that swallowed the city also protected it. Objects that would have deteriorated rapidly on land, organic materials, bronze items, wooden ship components, survived in the anaerobic environment of the seafloor, sealed under layers of protective silt that kept them from the bacteria and the oxygen that caused decay. The city was not just sunk, it was sealed. The very process of its destruction became the mechanism of its preservation, which is one of those strange geological ironies that makes the whole story feel slightly unreal. It is worth pausing on what the sediment layers tell us about the sequence of events, because the stratigraphy of the site, the order of the layers, is one of the main ways archaeologists reconstruct what happened and when. In some areas of the excavation, the collapsed remains of buildings sit directly on a disturbed sediment layer that shows signs of liquefaction, with clean silt deposited above the ruins. This pattern is consistent with a relatively rapid sinking event followed by gradual silting over. In other areas, the picture is more complicated, multiple layers of occupation debris indicating that people continued to use parts of the site even as other parts were sinking, patching and rebuilding and adapting to the changing ground conditions before eventually giving up and leaving. The timing question is genuinely difficult. The city was clearly still functioning in the 4th century BCE. The stele of Nectanebo I proves that. There is evidence of activity into the 2nd century BCE, and some finds suggest the site was not entirely abandoned even into the early centuries of the Common Era. The final, complete submersion is harder to pin down. Some geological and historical analyses suggest that major sinking events occurred between the 2nd century BCE and the 2nd century CE, with the process continuing more slowly after that. Other accounts point to evidence of significant events in the 6th to 8th centuries CE. The honest answer is that the city probably did not have a single final moment of submersion. Different parts of it went under at different times, and the process was spread across many centuries. What is clear is that by the time the Arab geographers were writing their descriptions of Egypt in the early medieval period, Thonis-Heracleion was not mentioned. It had passed out of living knowledge. The city that Herodotus had visited, that had collected taxes from Greek merchants for centuries, that had housed the temple where pharaohs received their divine mandate. That city was gone from the surface of the world and gone from the memory of the people living near where it had been. The water and the silt had done their work completely enough that even its location was uncertain. There is something worth sitting with in that image. The city did not burn, it was not sacked. No army tore down its temples or scattered its population. It simply sank slowly and relentlessly into the soft ground it had always been built on, until the water covered it, and the silt sealed it, and the world above continued without it. The people who had lived there, the priests, the merchants, the harbour workers, the royal officials, had presumably left before the end, moving to Alexandria or to other settlements along the delta as the conditions in Thonis-Heracleion became impossible. They took their portable wealth with them, their records, their traditions. What they left behind were the things too heavy to move or too embedded in the ground to extract. The great stone statues, the temple columns, the harbour infrastructure, the hundreds of anchors, the ships that had been beached for repair and never refloated. The delta continued to shift after the city went under. Sediment accumulated above the ruins, and the bay floor settled into its current configuration. The water that covers the site today is not particularly deep, 6 to 8 metres in most areas, but the silt above the ruins adds considerably to the effective burial depth. The city had been, in a sense, double buried, first by the water, then by the ongoing sedimentation of the delta, which continued to deposit material above the submerged ruins for centuries after they went under. Understanding this geological process also changes how we think about what might still be down there. If the sinking was gradual and the sediment cover came down relatively gently in many areas, then the preservation conditions should be good across most of the site. The things that were buried under soft silt rather than crushed by collapsing walls may be remarkably intact. The IEASM team has found ceramics with organic residue still inside them, wooden ship components that have survived 2,000 years underwater, bronze objects with their original surface detail still visible. These are not the kinds of finds you get from a violent, catastrophic destruction. They are the kinds of finds you get when a city is carefully, slowly swallowed by soft ground and left undisturbed for millennia. The geological story also has a contemporary resonance that is hard to ignore. The Nile Delta is still sinking, sea levels are still rising. The combination of subsidence and climate-driven sea level change means that parts of the modern delta, including areas with substantial populations, face the same long-term pressures that eventually swallowed Thonis-Heracleion. The city beneath Abu Qir Bay is, among other things, a physical record of what happens when a coastal settlement built on unstable sediment is subjected to those forces over a long enough period. It is not a comfortable record to look at. But for the purposes of understanding Thonis-Heracleion itself, the geological explanation does something important. It removes the mystery of the city's disappearance without diminishing the strangeness of it. There was no supernatural event, no divine punishment, no sudden catastrophe that can be pointed to as the moment everything ended. There was geology, operating slowly and indifferently, doing what delta geology does. The city sank because the ground it was built on was always going to sink eventually. The timing was partly determined by seismic events, partly by the accumulated weight of the city's own construction, partly by the slow regional subsidence that no one living there could have measured or fully understood. The people of Thonis-Heracleion did not know they were living on borrowed ground. They built their temples and their harbour walls and their streets with the same confidence that people have always built things, assuming that the earth beneath them was stable and permanent. The question that follows naturally from all of this is one of timing and sequence. The geological forces explain how the city sank, but the history of the city in its final centuries, the way it faded economically, the way its population likely dwindled before the ground gave way entirely, adds another layer to the story. Because Thonis-Heracleion did not just sink, it also declined, and those two processes, the geological and the historical, happened in parallel, reinforcing each other in ways that make the city's disappearance feel less like a single event and more like a long, slow unravelling that no one person alive at the time would have recognised as the end of something. The artefacts left behind in the city's final years have something to say about that, and they are worth looking at carefully. So let us think about the timeline more carefully, because the dates matter here, and the sequence of events tells a story that is more layered than a simple rise and fall. The stele found at the site, the decree of Nectanebo I, dates to somewhere between 380 and 362 BCE, which is the span of that pharaoh's reign. It is a tax decree, essentially, establishing that a portion of revenues collected at Thonis-Heracleion from Greek trade should be directed to the Temple of Neith at Sais. It is a bureaucratic document in many ways, a piece of administrative stone-cutting. But its presence in the city tells us something useful. As of the mid-4th century BCE, Thonis-Heracleion was functioning, organised and important enough that a reigning pharaoh was issuing formal decrees about its revenue flows. The city was not yet in decline. It was, by all available evidence, still very much the beating commercial heart of Egypt's northern coast. That changes within a generation. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great founded Alexandria, roughly 30 kilometres to the west. The founding of Alexandria is one of those events in ancient history that tends to get described in dramatic terms. The conqueror planting a new city at the edge of the sea, the surveyors marking out streets in the sand, the grand vision of a new capital, and it was dramatic in its way. But what often gets less attention is what Alexandria's founding meant for the places that already existed nearby. Thonis-Heracleion had been the entry point for Egypt's foreign trade for centuries. That function did not survive Alexander's vision for his new city. Alexandria was designed, from the beginning, to be a port, a trading hub, a cosmopolitan capital that would draw commerce from across the Mediterranean. It had a better natural harbour. It had the backing of the most powerful military force of its era. It had, very quickly, the infrastructure and the population to make it work. Thonis-Heracleion did not disappear overnight. That is important to understand. The city continued to exist, continued to be inhabited, and continued to function in some capacity for a considerable period after Alexandria rose to prominence. Archaeological evidence suggests continued occupation into at least the 2nd century BCE, and some objects found at the site suggest activity even later than that. The Temple of Amun-Gereb, which had been the city's religious centre and the site where pharaohs received their divine legitimacy, likely continued to operate for some time after the political and commercial centre of gravity had shifted west. Religious sites tend to outlast the economic conditions that originally supported them. People do not stop attending a temple simply because the harbour nearby has grown quieter, but quieter the harbour did grow. The tax revenue that had once flowed through Thonis-Heracleion, the fees collected from every Greek merchant ship entering Egypt, the customs inspections, the official transactions, all of that was redirected toward Alexandria. The Greek merchants who had maintained a quarter in Thonis-Heracleion and lived under Egyptian law while conducting their trade would have followed the commerce. They went where the business was, and the business was increasingly in Alexandria. The population of Thonis-Heracleion almost certainly began to shrink in the decades following 331 BCE, not catastrophically, not all at once, but steadily, as the practical reasons for being there diminished one by one. There is also the matter of the Ptolemaic period and what it meant for a city like this. The Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's death, were sophisticated administrators who understood the value of centralizing trade and revenue. Alexandria under the early Ptolemies became one of the most remarkable cities in the ancient world, growing to a population of perhaps 500,000 people by the 1st century BCE. The Library of Alexandria the lighthouse, the Mausion, the Grand Royal Quarter along the harbour. All of this was being built and expanded during the same period when Thonis-Heracleion was slowly, quietly losing its reason to exist. It is a strange kind of historical irony. The more brilliant Alexandria became, the more completely it eclipsed the city that had preceded it. What the archaeological record from Thonis-Heracleion itself shows, in terms of the final centuries of occupation, is a kind of gradual thinning. The density of finds from the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE is substantial. From the 2nd century BCE onward, the picture becomes somewhat sparser. Coins from the Ptolemaic period have been found at the site, which confirms that people were still there, still conducting transactions, still using the city in some form, but the volume of activity implied by the material record is clearly diminishing compared to the city's peak. The harbour, which had once been one of the busiest in the eastern Mediterranean, handling the entire flow of Greek trade into Egypt, would have been much quieter. The great warehouses and customs facilities that had defined the city's function were no longer needed at the same scale. The geological processes, meanwhile, were continuing regardless of what the economy was doing. The land beneath the city was still subsiding. The sediment of the Nile Delta was still compacting under the weight of everything built on top of it. Small seismic events, and the region is not immune to seismic activity, would have contributed to episodes of liquefaction, where the waterlogged sediment beneath building foundations momentarily lost its structural cohesion and allowed structures to tilt, crack, or partially sink. Residents of the city in its later centuries would have noticed these effects. Buildings that had stood straight were now leaning. Streets that had been level were now uneven. The harbour walls, which had been built to last, were showing signs of settlement and damage. This is the kind of thing that accelerates departure. A city that is already losing its economic purpose becomes much harder to stay in when the physical infrastructure is also visibly deteriorating. The combination of diminishing trade and increasingly unreliable ground would have created a steady pressure on the remaining population to relocate. Alexandria was right there. Prosperous, growing, architecturally magnificent, and built on somewhat more stable ground. The practical calculus for a merchant family or a temple priest in Thonis-Heracleion during, say, the 1st century BCE would not have been a difficult one. The question of exactly when the final major submersion events occurred is one that geologists and archaeologists have worked on carefully, and the answer is not a single date. The evidence points to a process that played out across several centuries, with different parts of the city going under at different times. Some areas may have become uninhabitable as early as the 2nd century BCE. Others appear to have remained above water considerably longer. The most current thinking, based on the stratigraphic analysis done by the IEASM team, suggests that the bulk of the submersion occurred somewhere in the range between the 2nd century BCE and the 8th century CE, a span of roughly 1,000 years, which is almost impossible to picture as a single event, but makes complete sense when you understand the geological mechanisms involved. The reference to Arab geographers is useful here. By the time Arab scholars were producing their detailed geographic descriptions of Egypt in the early medieval period, roughly the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries CE, Thonis-Heracleion is simply not mentioned. Alexandria is there, prominent and still important. The Nile Delta is described in some detail. But the city that had once been the mandatory entry point for all foreign ships entering Egypt, the city that Herodotus had visited and described, the city whose temple had legitimized pharaohs, that city had passed entirely out of living knowledge. Not suppressed, not deliberately forgotten, just gone. The water and the silt had completed their work, and the people living in the region no longer had any memory of what lay beneath the bay. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because it says something about how completely a place can be erased when its disappearance is gradual enough. A city destroyed by conquest leaves ruins that people can see and walk through and tell stories about. A city that burns, leaves ash and scorched stone that survives for centuries, but a city that sinks slowly into soft ground and is covered by water and silt leaves nothing visible at all. There is no rubble on the surface, no outline of walls, no displaced stone that catches the eye of a traveller passing through. The bay looks like a bay. The water looks like water. The city is simply absent from the world above, and after enough generations have passed without anyone seeing it, it becomes absent from memory as well. The stele of Naucratis, which was found at a different site but references Thonis-Heracleion directly, helped scholars understand that the city had been real and had been important. But even that document had been misread and misunderstood for years before its full significance was recognised. The city had left traces in texts, but those traces were scattered, sometimes ambiguous, and not sufficient to tell anyone where to look. It took the specific combination of modern sonar technology, a methodical survey of Abu Qir Bay, and a team willing to spend years working through sediment-covered seafloor before the city became findable again. The artefacts that date to the city's later period, the final centuries before the site went fully underwater, carry a particular kind of weight when you know what you're looking at. A Ptolemaic coin found in the sediment near the harbour is not just a coin, it is evidence that someone was there, conducting business, living their life, in a city that was already past its peak but not yet gone. A ceramic vessel from the 2nd century BCE, still sitting where it was placed, is evidence of a household or a workshop or a storage room that was abandoned at some point, its contents left behind because they were not worth carrying. The organic residue found inside some of these vessels, traces of wine, oil, grain, connects the objects to real daily use in a way that's quietly affecting. These were not ceremonial items. They were the ordinary containers of an ordinary working city. The large stone objects, the statues, the columns, the naos shrines, the stelae, tell a different part of the story. These were not abandoned carelessly. They were simply too heavy to move. The colossal statues of the pharaoh and queen, each standing several meters tall, were not objects that a departing population could take with them. The great pink granite stele of Nectanebo I, nearly 2 meters tall and weighing several tons, was not going anywhere regardless of what happened to the city around it. These objects stayed because they had to stay, and when the ground gave way beneath them and the water came in and the silt settled over them, they were preserved exactly where they had stood or fallen, in the positions they had occupied when the city was still alive. There is something in that image that is difficult to fully articulate. The statues did not know the city was ending. The stele did not know it was about to spend 2,000 years under silt. These objects simply remained, doing what stone does, which is to endure, while everything organic and portable and human was carried away or decomposed or dispersed. The city's final years were lived by people who left almost no individual trace. We do not know their names, we do not have their letters or their diaries. We have their coins and their pottery and the anchors from their ships, and we have the great stone monuments that outlasted them by millennia. What those objects collectively suggest is a city in long, slow twilight, still functioning in diminished form long after its moment of greatest importance had passed, still home to some population of priests and fishermen, and perhaps a few merchants who had reasons to stay, still the site of religious observances connected to the temple of Amun-Gareb, even as the grand commercial life of the harbour faded to a memory. The ground beneath all of them was sinking, slowly, imperceptibly, in any given year but measurably across a generation or a century. And at some point, probably not a single dramatic moment but a gradual crossing of a threshold, the conditions became incompatible with habitation. The last residents left, and Thonis-Heracleion passed from a living place into a submerged one. The question of what exactly those final inhabitants left behind, what the seafloor preserved when the city finally went quiet, is where the story becomes, in some ways, most extraordinary. Because the conditions that ended Thonis-Heracleion also happened to be precisely the conditions best suited to preserving what it left behind. The fine silt of Abu Qir Bay is not glamorous material. It is grey, soft, and tends to cloud the water the moment a diver disturbs it, reducing visibility to almost nothing in a matter of seconds. It is the kind of sediment that makes underwater archaeology genuinely difficult, because every careful brushstroke sends a small bloom of particles drifting outward, and the thing you're trying to see disappears behind it. But that same silt, accumulated over centuries in layers of increasing density, turned out to be one of the most effective preserving agents imaginable. It settled over Thonis-Heracleion slowly and evenly, sealing objects in place, cutting off oxygen, and creating an environment where things that would have decayed within years on a dry surface lasted for 2,000 years in nearly intact condition. This is the paradox that makes the site so remarkable to the archaeologists who work it. The process that destroyed the city also saved it. The water that covered the streets and filled the temples and swallowed the harbour also kept everything inside those spaces from being disturbed, looted, oxidised, or broken down by the ordinary passage of time. When Frank Godio's team began excavating in earnest after the initial survey in 2000, they were not finding the ruins of a city in the way that word is normally understood. They were finding a city that had been paused. One of the first large objects recovered, or rather documented and carefully raised in sections over time, was the stele of Nectanebo I. It stands 1.9 metres tall, inscribed in hieroglyphs, and it carries a royal decree concerning tax obligations on goods imported through the port. The decree specifies that a portion of the revenues collected at Thonis, as the Egyptian name appears in the text, should be donated to the temple of Neith at Sais. What makes this stele particularly significant is how closely it mirrors another stele found at a different location, the so-called Stele of Naucratis, which carries nearly identical language and was issued around the same time. The existence of two nearly identical royal decrees, one at each major port city, suggests a coordinated administrative system operating across Egypt's northern coast in the 4th century BCE. The Thonis stele fills in a gap that the Naucratis stele had left open for years. Together they paint a picture of a well-organised, legally regulated customs system that was anything but informal or improvised. The stele was not found standing upright. It had fallen, probably during one of the seismic or subsidence events that contributed to the city's decline, and lay flat on the seafloor, face down in the silt. This actually helped preserve the inscribed surface. The text was still clear enough, after more than 2 millennia underwater, to be read and translated by epigraphers. That is a remarkable thing to sit with. A legal document from the reign of an Egyptian pharaoh in the 4th century before the Common Era, still legible, still conveying its original bureaucratic intent, recovered from the floor of a bay. The bronze objects found at the site have their own story. Bronze, unlike iron, does not rust in the conventional sense underwater. It forms a patina, a layer of corrosion products that actually stabilizes and protects the metal beneath it. The result is that bronze artifacts from Thonis-Heracleion, once carefully cleaned and conserved, are often in extraordinary condition. Among the most significant is a statue of a pharaoh, approximately 2 meters tall, cast in bronze with a level of detail and craftsmanship that speaks to the city's wealth and its connection to the highest levels of Egyptian royal patronage. The statue was found in pieces. Bronze does not survive 2,000 years of silt pressure and occasional seismic movement without some damage. But the pieces were all present, close to one another, and the reconstruction is essentially complete. The face retains its features. The proportions are clear. It is the kind of object that, when you see photographs of it being raised from the water, makes the abstract idea of a lost city suddenly very concrete. There were also smaller bronze objects in large numbers, ritual figurines, some only a few centimetres tall, representing gods and sacred animals, offering vessels, parts of what appear to be ceremonial equipment from the temple precinct. These smaller objects are in some ways more informative than the large statues, because they represent the daily religious practice of the city rather than its monumental self-presentation. Someone carried these figurines to a temple and set them down as an offering. Someone used these vessels in a ceremony. The objects are traces of repeated human action, not just of royal ambition. The gold jewellery found at the site is modest in quantity, but significant in quality and variety. Rings, earrings, and small decorative pieces, some clearly Egyptian in style, and some showing Greek influence in their design. This mixture is not surprising given what we know about the city's population, but seeing it in physical form, a ring that might have been worn by a Greek merchant living in the city's foreign quarter, sitting in the same sediment layer as an amulet from an Egyptian temple, makes the cultural blending of the place feel real in a way that textual descriptions alone cannot quite achieve. The ceramics are perhaps the most numerous category of find. Thousands of vessels in varying states of completeness, representing a wide range of types and origins. Egyptian pottery, Greek amphorae, Phoenician containers, storage jars, drinking vessels, lamps, cooking pots. The range is exactly what you would expect from a major international port. Goods arriving in containers from across the Mediterranean world, the containers themselves becoming part of the archaeological record when they were discarded or left behind. Some of the amphorae still contained residue. Analysis of these residues has confirmed the presence of wine, olive oil, and resins consistent with the preservation of organic goods. The chemistry of what was stored in these vessels 2,500 years ago is still readable in the traces left on the interior walls. What the ceramics also reveal is chronology. Pottery styles change over time in ways that archaeologists can date with reasonable precision, and the distribution of ceramic types across different parts of the site helps build a picture of which areas were active at which periods. The harbour areas show a concentration of material from the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, consistent with the city's peak as a customs port. Deeper in the city, closer to the temple precinct, the material extends later into the Ptolemaic period of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. This suggests that even as the harbour declined after Alexandria's founding, the religious centre of the city remained in use for some time. People still coming to the temple, still conducting ceremonies, still depositing votive objects, even as the commercial life of the port wound down. The ships deserve particular attention. 64 ancient vessels have been identified in the harbour area of Thonis-Heracleion, which is an extraordinary number for a single site. They represent a range of types and sizes. There are large cargo vessels, their hulls collapsed and spread across the seafloor, but their basic forms still traceable. There are smaller boats, some of which appear to be rivercraft of the type used on the Nile rather than seagoing vessels. There is at least one large ceremonial barge, distinguished by its size and the quality of its construction materials, and there are vessels that may have been warships, though distinguishing military from commercial craft in the archaeological record is not always straightforward. The anchors are a category of find that tends to get less attention than the statues and the jewellery, but they are in some ways equally informative. More than 700 anchors have been recovered or documented at the site. They are made of lead, which is why they have survived so well. Lead does not corrode significantly in salt water over archaeological timescales. The anchors vary in size from small ones suitable for riverboats to large, heavy examples that would have held substantial seagoing vessels. The sheer number of them reflects the intensity of maritime traffic that passed through the harbour at its peak. Each anchor represents a vessel that stopped here, tied up, conducted its business, paid its taxes, unloaded its cargo, took on new goods, received its official clearance to enter Egypt, and then departed. 700 anchors is a lot of ships. Over the centuries the city was active, the harbour must have been a genuinely busy place, full of sailors speaking Greek and Phoenician and Egyptian, merchants negotiating prices, customs officials recording cargo, and temple priests conducting the religious formalities that gave the port its particular character. The wooden objects are the most fragile category of find and the most carefully handled. Wood does not survive well in most underwater environments, but the particular conditions of Abu Qir Bay, the fine silt, the relatively stable temperature, the low oxygen levels in the deeper sediment, preserved organic material far better than would normally be expected. Parts of ship hulls have been recovered, including planking and structural timbers that still retain their original form. Some of the wooden objects from the temple precinct appear to be parts of ceremonial equipment, the frames of sacred barks perhaps, or the supports for ritual objects. These are extraordinarily rare survivals. Wood from the ancient world is almost never found in such condition, and the ability to study actual construction techniques and materials from a 4th century BCE Egyptian context is something that archaeologists working on related sites can only envy. The coins found at the site span a long period, beginning with examples from the 4th century BCE and extending into later eras. The early coins are particularly interesting because they represent some of the first monetary exchange in Egyptian history. Coinage was a Greek innovation that Egypt adopted relatively late, and the presence of early coins at Thonis-Heracleion is consistent with the city's role as a point of contact between the Greek monetary economy and the older Egyptian system of commodity exchange. A coin minted in a Greek city-state found in the harbour sediment of an Egyptian port is a small but tangible piece of evidence for the economic integration that was happening across the eastern Mediterranean in this period. There is also a category of object that is harder to classify, but perhaps the most humanly affecting: the small votive offerings, faience amulets, tiny figurines of gods and animals, miniature vessels, small plaques with inscriptions. These are the objects that ordinary people brought to the temple when they wanted something, when they were sick, or frightened, or grateful, or hoping for a child, or a safe voyage, or a good harvest. They are not grand art. They are not royal commissions. They are the residue of private religious life, of individual people making their small negotiations with the divine. Hundreds of them were found in and around the temple precinct, deposited over centuries, accumulated in the way that such offerings always accumulate at active religious sites, quietly, persistently, in numbers that eventually become significant simply through the passage of time. What all of these objects together create is something more than an inventory of a lost city. They create a texture, a sense of what it was actually like to be in Thonis-Heracleion on an ordinary day in, say, the 5th century BCE. The harbour full of ships, the customs officials moving from vessel to vessel with their tablets and their scales, the merchants carrying amphorae of Greek wine past priests heading toward the temple, the smell of salt water and fish and the particular dusty warmth of a delta city in summer, the small bronze figurine that someone carried carefully through the streets and set down in the temple precinct as an offering, the coin that changed hands in a market transaction and ended up dropped in the mud near the harbour, the anchor that held a ship steady overnight while its crew slept and was never retrieved because the ship left in a hurry, or the anchor chain broke, or the vessel was simply abandoned. The preservation conditions of the site mean that the story these objects tell is unusually complete for a place this old. Most ancient cities, even well-excavated ones, yield fragments: a few ceramics here, a coin hoard there, a building foundation, an inscription. Thonis-Heracleion yields fragments too, of course, but it yields them in extraordinary density and variety, and the fact that the entire site has remained essentially undisturbed since the city's final submersion means that the spatial relationships between objects are still meaningful. Where something was found tells you something about what it was doing there. The distribution of Greek pottery in the northeastern part of the site helps define the boundaries of the Greek quarter. The concentration of votive objects near the temple tells you where the religious activity was centred. The clustering of anchors and ship remains in the harbour basin, tells you where the maritime life of the city was organised. All of this is, of course, filtered through the work of excavation. The careful, slow, painstaking process of removing silt from objects that have not been touched for 2 millennia, of recording positions and orientations, of lifting fragile ceramics and corroded metal without destroying them, of making sense of a three-dimensional site through the two-dimensional medium of a diver's field notes and a photogrammetric survey. The work is ongoing. The objects already recovered represent only a fraction of what the site contains. And what those objects have already told us about the people who lived and worked in Thonis-Heracleion is remarkable enough that the prospect of what remains to be found is genuinely exciting to the archaeologists involved. But the artifacts are not only evidence of daily life and commerce. They are also evidence of something larger, of a city that was, at its height, one of the most important religious sites in Egypt, a place where the gods were actively present in the life of the community, where the relationship between the divine and the political was enacted in physical space through ceremony and monument, and the careful observance of ritual. The temple of Amun-Gereb was not incidental to Thonis-Heracleion. It was the reason the city existed in the form it did, the reason pharaohs came here, the reason the city had the particular character it had. And the evidence for that religious life, the nail shrines, the votive barks, the ritual objects, the offerings, points toward a story that goes deeper than commerce and customs and Greek merchants and tax decrees. That story begins with a god whose name most people today have never heard, but who was, in the world of ancient Egypt, one of the most important divine figures in the entire religious landscape. Amun-Gereb. Not simply Amun, the great state god whose temple complex at Karnak is one of the largest religious structures ever built by human hands, but a specific form of Amun, Amun-Gereb, associated with fertility, with the generative power of the Nile, with the annual flooding that made Egyptian civilization possible in the first place. The distinction mattered. Egyptian religion was not a simple system of interchangeable deities. The gods had aspects, forms, local identities, particular relationships to specific places and functions. Amun-Gereb was the Amun of the Nile Delta, the Amun of abundance and water, and his temple at Thonis-Heracleion was not simply one religious building among many. It was the heart of the city, possibly, in certain senses, the reason the city existed at all in the position and form it did. The temple stood on the central island of Thonis-Heracleion, surrounded by the canals and basins that define the city's geography. We know something of its scale from what the seafloor has preserved. The collapsed columns and walls, now spread across a wide area of sediment, suggest a structure of considerable size. Not Karnak, but substantial by any measure, a building that would have dominated the skyline of the island and been visible from ships approaching through the delta channels. The orientation, the layout, the presence of monumental statuary around its perimeter, all of this is consistent with the major temple complexes of the late period when the city was at its height. Pharaohs came here, that is not a minor detail. The temple of Amun-Gereb at Thonis-Heracleion was, according to the evidence, a place where Egyptian rulers came to receive divine legitimacy, where the authority of the pharaoh was confirmed through ceremony, through the presence of the god, through the enactment of ritual in a specific sacred space. Before a pharaoh could be fully recognized as the rightful ruler of Egypt, he needed the blessing of Amun, and in the Nile Delta that blessing was given here. This gives the city a political weight that goes beyond its role as a customs port. Yes, the ships came through. Yes, the taxes were collected. But the temple meant that Thonis-Heracleion was also a place of royal power, of divine sanction, of the kind of ceremony that held the Egyptian state together in its deepest symbolic sense. The two functions, commercial and sacred, were not separate in the ancient world in the way we might instinctively imagine them to be. The same city that processed foreign merchants and collected duties on imported goods also performed the rites that confirmed a king's right to rule. That combination was not unusual in ancient Egypt, but it does give Thonis-Heracleion a particular density of significance that the archaeology has been slowly revealing. Among the objects found in and around the temple precinct, the naos shrines deserve particular attention. A naos, from the Greek word for temple or inner shrine, is a stone box, essentially, designed to house a cult statue of a god. They were placed in the innermost sanctuary of Egyptian temples, the most sacred space, accessible only to priests. Finding Naos shrines in the ruins of the temple of Amun-Gereb is not surprising, but the condition and character of the examples recovered from the site are remarkable. One of the most significant is a large naos in pink granite, the same warm-toned stone used for some of the most important royal monuments in Egyptian history. Pink granite came from the quarries at Aswan, far to the south, and its use indicates resources and royal patronage. A naos in pink granite is not a routine object. It is a statement of importance, of investment, of the seriousness with which the cult of Amun-Gereb was regarded by whoever commissioned it. The naos found at Thonis-Heracleion is damaged. The water and sediment and the weight of the centuries have not been entirely kind, but it is identifiable, measurable, and it tells you something about the scale of religious activity at this site. Someone ordered this object made. Someone transported it from the Aswan quarries down the Nile through the delta to this island in Abu Qir Bay. Someone placed it in the innermost sanctuary of the temple and maintained the rituals associated with it for generations. That chain of human action, stretching across centuries and hundreds of kilometers, is compressed into a single stone box sitting on the seafloor. Then there are the votive barks. These are small boats, not full-size vessels, but model boats, sacred boats, used in religious processions. In Egyptian religious practice, the gods travelled. Their cult statues were placed in sacred barks and carried in procession during festivals, brought out of the inner sanctuary and displayed to worshippers, floated on sacred lakes or along canals in ceremonies that combined spectacle with deep theological meaning. The movement of the god through the world was itself an act of divine power, a renewal of the relationship between the divine and the human. Votive barks found in the temple precinct at Thonis-Heracleion are physical evidence of exactly this kind of ceremony. They were used here, in this place, in religious processions that took place on the canals surrounding the central island. And this connects directly to one of the most important religious events in the Egyptian calendar, evidence for which has been found at Thonis-Heracleion, the mysteries of Osiris. This was an annual festival, celebrated across Egypt but with particular intensity in certain sacred locations, commemorating the death and resurrection of Osiris, the god of the dead, of regeneration, of the eternal cycle. The mysteries of Osiris involved boat processions, ritual performances, and ceremonies that lasted for days. They were among the most emotionally significant events in the Egyptian religious year, drawing large numbers of participants and observers. Evidence found at Thonis-Heracleion, including ritual objects associated with Osiris and the particular configuration of the waterways around the temple, suggest that the city was one of the sites where these ceremonies took place. The canals were not just transportation infrastructure, they were sacred routes, used by the barks carrying the image of the god during the festival. What makes this particularly interesting is the question of who was watching, because Thonis-Heracleion was not a purely Egyptian city. Greek merchants lived here. Greek sailors passed through constantly, and there is evidence, in the form of Greek-style offerings found in the temple precinct, in the accounts of ancient writers, in the general pattern of Greek engagement with Egyptian religion during this period, that Greek visitors participated in, or at least observed these ceremonies. Herodotus, who was in Egypt around 450 BCE and who was clearly fascinated by Egyptian religion, describes Egyptian religious practices with a mixture of respect and curiosity. He was the kind of observer who paid attention, and the city he would have passed through on his way into Egypt, the mandatory customs port, the place where every foreign ship had to stop, was Thonis-Heracleion. The idea of a Greek merchant or traveller standing at the edge of a canal in Thonis-Heracleion, watching a sacred bark pass in procession during the mysteries of Osiris, is not speculation. It is a reasonable inference from the physical evidence and the historical record. The city was structured in a way that made such encounters almost inevitable. The Greek quarter was part of the same urban fabric as the Egyptian temple. The canals that served the harbour also served the religious processions. The people who lived and worked here Egyptians, Greeks, Phoenicians, others, shared a physical space in which the boundaries between commercial life and religious life were permeable in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct, but that the archaeology keeps gesturing toward. The Greek presence in the temple area is evidenced not just by the style of certain offerings, but by the specific objects themselves. Small figurines that combine Egyptian and Greek iconographic elements, a goddess with features that could belong to either Isis or Aphrodite, a votive object that follows Egyptian form but uses Greek decorative conventions. These hybrid objects are the material trace of people who are living between two religious worlds, borrowing from both, finding equivalences and overlaps, doing the slow, practical work of cultural synthesis that happens when different peoples share a space over long periods of time. This is not the grand narrative of cultural exchange that tends to dominate textbook accounts of the Greek-Egyptian relationship. This is the small-scale, daily, informal version of it. People adapting their religious practices to the environment they were living in, making offerings in a foreign temple because it was the temple that was there, because the god might listen, because the ritual felt recognizable enough. The pink granite naos, the votive barks, the Osiris ritual objects, the hybrid figurines, together they describe a religious life of considerable complexity and vitality. The temple of Amun-Gereb was not a static monument. It was a living institution, maintained by priests, visited by worshippers, used for ceremonies that involved the whole city, connected to the royal court through the legitimacy rituals, and open in some sense to the foreign populations who passed through and lived within the city's boundaries. It was, in other words, exactly what you might expect from the main entry port of one of the most religiously sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world. There is one more layer to the religious significance of Thonis-Heracleion that is worth pausing on. The city's Egyptian name, Thonis, and its Greek name, Heracleion, reflect the same pattern of dual identity that appears in its religious life. The Greeks called it Heracleion because they associated the city with Heracles, Hercules, their great hero of strength and endurance. This was a common Greek practice. When they encountered foreign gods or sacred sites, they identified them with figures from their own mythology. The Egyptian god Khonsu, associated with the moon and healing, was sometimes identified with Heracles by Greek visitors. The temple of Amun-Gereb may have seemed to Greek eyes like a temple, to a god they could map onto their own traditions. This process of identification, what scholars call interpretatio Graeca, the Greek interpretation of foreign religious figures, was one of the mechanisms through which Greek and Egyptian religion began to merge in the centuries before Alexander the Great arrived, and made that merger a political project as well as a cultural one. So when you look at the temple precinct of Thonis-Heracleion, you're looking at something that was already, centuries before Alexandria was founded, a place where Egyptian and Greek religious life were in active conversation. The city was doing the work of synthesis before there was an official policy of synthesis. The priests of Amun-Gereb were performing ceremonies in a city where Greek merchants were their neighbours. The Greek merchants were watching those ceremonies, making offerings in the temple, finding their own Heracles in the Egyptian god. The physical evidence of all of this is sitting on the seafloor of Abu Kirbe, preserved in silt, waiting for the next diving season. What the religious archaeology of Thonis-Heracleion ultimately reshapes is not just our understanding of this one city, but our understanding of the relationship between Egypt and the Greek world in the centuries before Alexander. That relationship has often been told as a story of conquest and transformation. The Greeks arriving, the Ptolemies taking over, Alexandria rising, Egyptian culture being gradually Hellenized. But Thonis-Heracleion tells an older, quieter story, a story of contact that preceded conquest by centuries, a story of two cultures sharing a city, sharing a waterway, sharing a religious landscape, adapting to each other in the practical, untheorized way that people do when they live in close proximity over long periods of time. The grand synthesis of the Ptolemaic period, the cult of Serapis, the combined Greek-Egyptian religious identity, the the cosmopolitan culture of Alexandria, did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from places like this, from cities where the mixing had already been happening for generations, quietly, at the level of the individual offering and the shared canal, and the Greek merchant watching the Osiris procession from the edge of the water. That is a significant revision to a story that has usually been told with Alexandria as its starting point, and it comes not from a new reading of ancient texts, but from objects found on the floor of a bay that no one was looking at for over 1,000 years. The stelae, the naus, the votive barks, the hybrid figurines, each one a small piece of evidence for a world that was more connected, more fluid, and more religiously alive than the standard account had suggested. The Temple of Amun-Gereb was not just a building, it was a meeting place in the deepest sense, a place where the divine and the political and the commercial and the cultural all came together in the particular geography of the Nile Delta, surrounded by water, open to the sea, and open, it turns out, to the world. And that world had a very specific human face, the face of the Greek merchants, sailors, and travellers who made Thonis-Heracleion their first stop in Egypt, who lived in their own quarter of the city, who traded and worshipped and left behind the physical traces of their presence that the seafloor has now given back to us. What their community looked like, how it was organised, what rules governed their lives in this foreign city, and what they left behind, that is the next layer of the story. The Greek quarter of Thonis-Heracleion was not a ghetto, and it was not a colony. It was something more specific and more interesting than either of those words suggests. It was a designated zone within an Egyptian city where foreign merchants, primarily Greek but also Phoenician and others, were permitted to live, trade, and maintain a degree of their own cultural identity, all under the framework of Egyptian law. This kind of arrangement was not unusual in the ancient world, but Thonis-Heracleion represents one of the earliest and most thoroughly documented examples of it, and the physical evidence recovered from the seafloor gives us a picture of that community that no ancient text had been able to provide on its own. The Greek pottery found in the excavations tells part of the story. Amphorae from the Aegean Islands, Chios, Samos, Lesbos, have been recovered from specific zones of the site, concentrated in areas that correspond to what would have been the commercial and residential districts of the foreign quarter. These are not isolated finds. There are hundreds of ceramic fragments, and they follow a clear spatial pattern. Greek goods were arriving here in significant quantities, and people with Greek taste were consuming them in a specific part of the city. The distribution of the pottery is, in a quiet way, a map of where the Greek community lived and worked. Greek coins have also been found, some dating to the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Coins from Corinth, Athens, and several Aegean cities have turned up in the sediment. This is not surprising. A port city that served as the mandatory entry point for all Greek trade with Egypt would naturally accumulate coinage from across the Greek world. But the specific distribution of those coins, mixed with Egyptian bronze vessels and faience amulets in the same sediment layers, suggests a commercial environment where Greek and Egyptian currency and goods were in daily circulation together. Somebody was making change. Somebody was weighing silver. The mundane machinery of trade was running continuously in this city, and the seafloor has preserved its residue. The Decree of Naucratis is worth pausing on here, because it is one of the most important documents to emerge from the Thonis-Heracleion excavation, and its significance is easy to underestimate. The stele bearing this decree was found in the ruins of the temple precinct. It is 1.90 meters tall, carved from black granodiorite, and it dates to the reign of Nectanebo I, who ruled Egypt from 380 to 362 BCE. The text of the decree establishes that a 10% tax on all goods imported or exported through the Greek trading port of Naucratis, a city further south in the delta, was to be redirected to the Temple of Neith at Se. But what makes the stele found at Thonis-Heracleion particularly significant is that it is nearly identical to another stele found at Naucratis itself. The same decree, carved in the same language, erected at both sites. and the Thonis-Heracleion version makes explicit that Thonis was the customs port through which all Greek ships entering Egypt were required to pass. This is not a minor administrative detail. It means that every Greek merchant, sailor or traveller arriving in Egypt during this period, and the period in question stretches back well before Nectanebo I into the earlier centuries of Greek-Egyptian contact, had to stop at Thonis-Heracleion first. Their goods were inspected here, their taxes were collected here, their ships were registered here. The city was, in the most literal sense, the gateway to Egypt for the entire Greek world, and that means the volume of Greek presence in this city over the centuries of its operation was enormous. Not just a small community of resident merchants, but a constant flow of ships and crews and travellers, all of them passing through, all of them spending time here, some of them staying. The small Greek sanctuaries found within the city add another dimension to this picture. These were not major temples. They were modest structures, shrines really, where Greek sailors and merchants could make offerings to their own gods before or after a voyage. The kind of place a sailor might stop at to thank Poseidon for a safe crossing, or to ask for good weather on the way home. Several of these structures have been identified in the excavation data, located in areas of the city separate from the great temple of Amun-Gereb. They are small, unpretentious, and completely practical. They are also evidence that the Egyptian authorities permitted the Greek community to maintain its own religious life within the city's boundaries, which is a significant detail about how this coexistence actually worked. Among the objects found in and around these areas are figurines of Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty. Some of these figurines are purely Greek in style, made in the tradition of Aegean workshops. Others show signs of Egyptian influence in their manufacture or iconography. A few are genuinely hybrid objects, combining Greek figural conventions with Egyptian decorative elements in ways that suggest they were made locally, possibly by craftspeople who were working in both traditions simultaneously. This is exactly the kind of small-scale cultural mixing that is almost impossible to trace through written sources alone. A hybrid Aphrodite figurine found in the sediment of Abu Qir Bay is a piece of evidence that no ancient historian thought to record, but it tells you something very specific about the lived experience of people in this city, about the way Greek and Egyptian visual cultures were in constant informal dialogue at the level of the workshop and the marketplace. The name Heracleion itself is worth dwelling on for a moment. The Greeks called this city after Heracles, their great hero, the figure of strength and endurance and divine parentage who appears throughout Greek mythology as the archetype of the mortal who achieves something close to godhood. When Greek sailors arrived at this port and called it Heracleion, they were doing something very specific. They were claiming it, at least nominally, within their own cultural framework. They were saying, this place has a connection to our world, to our stories, to our gods. Heracles was supposed to have founded a temple here, or visited here, or been honoured here. The specific tradition varies depending on which ancient source you read, but the general idea is consistent. The Greeks wanted this important Egyptian port to have a Greek story attached to it. This was, as mentioned in the context of the religious life of the city, a common Greek practice, the interpretatio Graeca, the habit of mapping foreign gods and sacred sites onto Greek equivalents. But in the case of Thonis-Heracleion, the practice went beyond simple naming. There is evidence in the archaeological record that actual Greek religious activity was taking place in the city, not just observation of Egyptian ceremonies, but Greek ritual practice, Greek dedications, Greek votive objects. The community was not simply passing through. It had roots, routines, and its own religious infrastructure. What this means, when you step back from the individual finds and think about the city as a whole, is that Thonis-Heracleion was practicing something that we might call managed coexistence. The Egyptian authorities set the rules, Egyptian law governed commerce, the temple of Amun-Gereb governed the religious and political legitimacy of the city, and the customs system ensured that Egyptian interests were protected. Within that framework, the Greek community had space to operate according to its own customs, maintain its own shrines, use its own currency, and live something close to its own way of life. It was not equality, exactly. The Greeks were guests in an Egyptian city, and the terms of their presence were set by Egyptian institutions. But it was a functional arrangement, and it lasted for centuries. That is worth noting. This was not a temporary accommodation or an experiment. It was a stable, long-running system of cultural coexistence that worked, more or less, for a very long time. The broader context for this arrangement is the late period of Egyptian history, roughly 664 to 332 BCE, during which Egypt had increasingly frequent and complex interactions with the Greek world. Greek mercenaries fought in Egyptian armies. Greek merchants traded in Egyptian ports. Greek travellers visited Egyptian temples and wrote about what they saw, Herodotus being the most famous example. The Egyptian pharaohs of this period, particularly those of the 26th dynasty, actively encouraged Greek settlement and trade as a way of strengthening Egypt's commercial and military position. Naucratis, the Greek trading colony established in the Delta in the 7th century BCE, was the official centre of this policy, but Thonis-Heracleion was, in a sense, the front door, the place where the policy was implemented in practice every time a Greek ship arrived and was directed to the customs dock. The Persian occupation of Egypt, which occurred twice during the late period, first under Cambyses in 525 BCE and again under Artaxerxes III in 343 BCE, added another layer of complexity to the city's cultural identity. During the Persian periods, Thonis-Heracleion continued to function as a port, and the Persian administration had its own relationship with both the Greek and Egyptian communities within the city. Some of the artefacts found in the excavation may date to the Persian periods, though distinguishing them from earlier or later material is not always straightforward. What the Persian occupation did not do, apparently, was disrupt the fundamental functioning of the city as a commercial and religious centre. The port kept operating, the temple kept receiving offerings, the Greek community kept trading. By the time Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt in 332 BCE and founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast just west of Abukir Bay, Thonis-Heracleion had been functioning as the main entry port for Egypt for somewhere between 2 and 3 centuries. The transition that followed, the shift of trade and political power to Alexandria, did not happen overnight. The archaeological evidence suggests that Thonis-Heracleion continued to be inhabited and to function commercially well into the Ptolemaic period, the era of Greek-Egyptian rule that followed Alexander's death. But the energy, the investment and the traffic were gradually redirected westward toward the new city. The Greek quarter of Thonis-Heracleion did not vanish immediately. It faded, as the city itself faded over generations. What the Greek presence in Thonis-Heracleion ultimately demonstrates is something that is easy to state but surprisingly difficult to fully absorb. Alexandria did not invent Greek-Egyptian cultural contact. It institutionalized and amplified something that had been developing organically for centuries in places like this. The famous synthesis of the Ptolemaic period, the combined religious cults, the multilingual scholarship, the cosmopolitan urban culture, had deep roots in the practical daily experience of Greeks and Egyptians living and working alongside each other in the delta ports. Thonis-Heracleion was one of the primary laboratories for that experience. The hybrid Aphrodite figurines, the Greek pottery alongside Egyptian bronze, the small sanctuaries next to the great temple, the decree of Naucratis carved in stone and placed in the heart of the city. These are not footnotes to the story of Greek-Egyptian civilization. They are early chapters of it. There is something quietly compelling about the way the seafloor has preserved this evidence. The Greek quarter of Thonis-Heracleion did not survive in texts. No ancient writer thought to describe the daily life of the Greek merchants living in their designated zone, the specific layout of their shrines, the particular mix of objects in their homes. That kind of granular, human-scale evidence almost never makes it into the literary record of the ancient world. But the silt of Abu Qir Bey preserved it anyway. The pottery, the coins, the figurines, the small ritual objects, in a kind of accidental archive that no one planned and no one maintained. The water that swallowed the city also kept it. What this means for our understanding of how ancient cultures actually mixed, not in the grand political sense, but in the everyday sense of people negotiating shared space, shared commerce, and shared religious landscapes, is considerable. The evidence from Thonis-Heracleion suggests that the process was messier, more fluid, and more interesting than the standard narrative of cultural exchange tends to allow. It was not a story of one culture absorbing another, or of two cultures maintaining strict separation. It was a story of constant low-level interaction producing hybrid objects, hybrid practices, and hybrid identities that do not fit neatly into either the Egyptian or the Greek category. And it was happening here, in this port city on the edge of the delta, centuries before anyone decided to make it official policy. The excavation of that Greek presence is ongoing. New finds continue to add detail to the picture, and the spatial analysis of the site is still being refined. As the mapping of the city becomes more precise, archaeologists are developing a clearer sense of the boundaries and internal organisation of the Greek quarter, where it began, where it ended, how it related to the Egyptian residential and commercial areas, and how those boundaries may have shifted over the centuries of the city's operation. That work is slow, careful, and requires the kind of patience that underwater archaeology demands above almost everything else. But it is producing results, and those results are changing the story in ways that will take years to fully absorb. The excavation itself, what has been found since the initial discovery in 2000, how the technology has evolved, and what the seafloor still holds, is a story worth telling in its own right. So when Frank Godio's team returned to Abu Qir Bey in the years following that initial discovery in 2000, they were not returning to a site that had given up its secrets. They were returning to a site that had barely introduced itself. The first surveys had established the outline of something enormous. The follow-up work conducted across dozens of dive seasons stretching through the 2000s and 2010s and into the 2020s has been the slow, patient process of learning what that outline actually contains. The excavation is still active. That is worth pausing on for a moment. More than 2 decades after the first stele broke the surface of the sediment, archaeologists are still finding things in Thonis-Heracleion that no one has seen in over 1,000 years. The site has not been exhausted. It has barely been opened. Current estimates suggest that somewhere between 3 and 5% of the total site area has been fully excavated. The rest, the canals, the residential quarters, the outlying harbour zones, the areas beyond the central island, remains largely undisturbed beneath the silt and water of the bay. What has come out of the site in recent years has continued to surprise even the researchers who have spent their careers working there. In 2021, the team announced the discovery of a submerged funerary complex from the late period, a burial site that included a Greek-style tumulus, which is essentially a burial mound sitting underwater in the bay. This was an unexpected find. Tumuli are a distinctly Greek form of burial, and finding one here, submerged in the harbour area of an Egyptian port city, added yet another dimension to the already complicated picture of cultural coexistence at the site. The complex also included a Greek sanctuary and a series of burial gifts, ceramics, bronze objects, and other items that dated to the 4th and 5th centuries BCE. The combination of Greek burial architecture with Egyptian context sitting on the floor of the bay is the kind of thing that takes time to fully interpret. Researchers are still working through what it means for the social geography of the city. Then, in 2022, the team made another significant find. A Ptolemaic-era military vessel was discovered buried under approximately 5 meters of clay and shipwreck debris. The ship was well preserved, its wooden hull still largely intact after more than 2,000 years in the sediment. It was a warship, or at least a vessel built for military use, and its presence in that particular location, buried deep beneath layers of collapsed material, suggests it may have sunk during a major event, possibly the same seismic or flooding episode that contributed to the city's broader submersion. The ship measured roughly 25 meters in length. It still contained fragments of its original rigging, and the clay that had sealed it had protected the wood from the kind of deterioration that usually destroys organic material over centuries. Finding a ship this intact, this deep, and this well preserved is not a routine occurrence in underwater archaeology. It was by any measure a remarkable find. These recent discoveries point to something that the researchers have been saying for years, but that is easy to underestimate. The site is not a static archive. It is a layered, complex environment in which new things become accessible as excavation techniques improve, as the mapping of the site becomes more refined, and as the team develops a better understanding of where to look. The 64 ships catalogued in the harbour area represent only the vessels found so far. The total number of ships that passed through, anchored in, or sank in the harbour of Thonis-Heracleion over its centuries of operation is unknown, and it is entirely possible that more remain buried in areas that have not yet been thoroughly surveyed. The practical challenges of working at this site are considerable, and they are worth describing in some detail, because they shape everything about what can be found and how quickly. The water above the site ranges from about 4 to 9 meters in depth, which is shallow enough for divers to work without the extreme pressure challenges of deep-sea archaeology, but shallow water brings its own problems. Visibility in Abu Qir Bay is often poor. The silt that has preserved so many of the artifacts is also the silt that clouds the water when disturbed. Divers working in the sediment can reduce their visibility to near zero within seconds of beginning to excavate. This means that much of the physical work has to be done slowly and carefully, often by touch as much as by sight, with the diver moving through a murky suspension of fine particles that has been sitting undisturbed for centuries. The sediment itself is both friend and enemy to the excavation. On one hand, it is the reason the artifacts survived. The fine silt of the Nile Delta acts as a near-perfect preservation medium for certain materials. Bronze, gold, stone and ceramics all survive well in it. On the other hand, the sediment is unstable. Disturbing it incorrectly can damage fragile objects before they can be properly documented. Organic materials, wood, textiles, rope, require immediate conservation treatment once they are exposed to open water and oxygen after centuries of anaerobic burial. The logistics of managing that transition, from the seafloor to a conservation laboratory, involve careful planning and specialised equipment that not every archaeological project has access to. To address some of these challenges, the IESM team has incorporated increasingly sophisticated technology into the excavation process. Sub-bottom profilers, sonar devices that can see beneath the seafloor surface, are used to identify buried structures and objects before divers go anywhere near them. This allows the team to plan excavation sequences more effectively, targeting areas where the sonar suggests significant buried material rather than digging blindly. Nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometers, the same type of equipment that helped locate the site in the first place, continue to be used to detect metal objects buried in the sediment. The combination of these remote sensing tools with physical diving creates a workflow that's more efficient than traditional underwater excavation, though it is still slow by any standard comparison to land-based archaeology. Three-dimensional photogrammetry has become an increasingly important tool for documenting finds in situ. That is, in their original position before they are moved. By taking overlapping photographs from multiple angles and processing them through specialised software, the team can create detailed three-dimensional models of objects and structures on the seafloor. These models serve as a permanent record of exactly where and how things were found, which is crucial for the interpretive work that happens later. Knowing that a particular bronze figurine was found at a specific location relative to the temple wall, or that a group of ceramic vessels was clustered in a way that suggests a storage room rather than a rubbish deposit, can completely change how archaeologists understand what they are looking at. The three-dimensional record preserves that spatial information even after the objects have been removed. Remotely operated vehicles, small underwater robots equipped with cameras and sometimes with manipulator arms, are used for survey work in areas where sending divers is impractical or too risky. These ROVs can navigate through narrow spaces, hover in place while recording high-resolution video, and cover large areas of the seafloor more quickly than a team of divers. They do not replace divers for detailed excavation work, but they are invaluable for reconnaissance and for monitoring areas of the site that are not currently being actively excavated. The footage they collect feeds into the ongoing mapping of the site, which is itself a continuous project rather than a completed document. The collaboration between the IIAESM and Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, now known as the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, has been a central feature of the excavation from the beginning. Egyptian archaeologists and conservators work alongside the IEASM team, and the artifacts that are recovered are subject to Egyptian cultural heritage law, which means they remain in Egypt. Many of the most significant objects from Thonis-Heracleion are now held in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and in the Maritime Museum in Alexandria, where they are available for study and exhibition. A major international exhibition, Origins of Christianity and Islam, which toured European museums in the 2000s and included objects from the submerged sites of the Delta, introduced the finds from Thonis-Heracleion to a broad public audience for the first time. The colossal statue of Hapi, the pink granite naos, and the stele of Nectanebo I have all been exhibited outside Egypt, though they are ultimately returned to Egyptian collections. The question of what else might be waiting beneath the sediment of Abu Qir Bay is one that the researchers themselves are careful not to answer too confidently. The site has already produced surprises: the funerary tumulus, the military vessel, the sheer quantity of anchors and ships, that no one predicted based on the initial surveys. There is a general expectation that continued excavation will produce more significant finds, but the specific nature of those finds is genuinely unknown. Some researchers have suggested that residential areas of the city, which have so far been less thoroughly explored than the central temple precinct and the harbour zone, may contain evidence of daily life that is even more detailed and intimate than what has been found so far. The domestic spaces of an ancient city, the rooms where people ate, slept, stored their belongings, raised their children, tend to preserve a different kind of evidence than public or religious spaces. If those areas of Thonis-Heracleion are as well preserved as the rest of the site, what they might reveal about the everyday experience of living in a late-period Egyptian port city is genuinely difficult to predict. There are also questions about the outer edges of the city, the areas beyond the central island and the main harbour, that remain largely unexplored. The city's estimated footprint of around 110 square kilometres is itself an approximation based on survey data rather than complete excavation. The actual boundaries of the settled area, the extent of the canal network, and the locations of neighbourhoods and districts beyond the core of the city are still being mapped. Some of the most interesting discoveries in urban archaeology come from the periphery of cities rather than their centres, the areas where the formal organisation of the city begins to break down, where informal settlements developed, where the city's relationship with the surrounding landscape and waterways was most directly expressed. At Thonis-Heracleion, those peripheral zones are still largely terra incognita, or perhaps more precisely aqua incognita. What drives the ongoing excavation beyond the obvious scientific interest is something that is easy to feel but hard to articulate. There is a particular quality to the experience of recovering something from a place where it has been undisturbed for more than a millennium. The objects from Thonis-Heracleion were not simply lost and then found. They were sealed away, preserved in conditions that prevented almost any change, and then gradually, carefully, brought back into contact with the world above the water. The bronze pharaoh standing in the sediment, the ceramic vessels still faintly containing the residue of whatever they once held, the anchors scattered across the harbour floor. These things have a continuity of existence that is almost difficult to think about clearly. They were here before. They are still here. The water changed their context, but not their substance. That quality of preservation and the scale of what remains to be found is what makes Thonis-Heracleion one of the most significant active archaeological projects in the world right now. Not significant in the sense of famous, though it is becoming more widely known. Significant in the sense that it is genuinely producing new knowledge about a period and a place that we understood poorly before, and that it will continue to produce that knowledge for decades to come. The 3 to 5% that has been excavated has already rewritten parts of the historical record. What the remaining 95% might contain is a question that keeps the researchers coming back to Abu Kirbe, season after season, descending into the murky water above a city that has been waiting with remarkable patience to be understood. And understanding it fully, not just the physical remains, but what they mean, what they change, what they confirm and what they contradict, is the work that comes after the excavation. The significance of Thonis-Heracleion is not only in what has been pulled from the sediment, but in what it does to the larger picture of ancient history when you hold it up to the light. That larger picture is worth sitting with for a moment, because one of the things that Thonis-Heracleion does, quietly, almost without announcing itself, is change the way we understand a period of history that we thought we already understood reasonably well. Before the discovery of this city, the relationship between ancient Egypt and the Greek world in the centuries before Alexander the Great was something that historians and archaeologists had pieced together mainly from texts. From Herodotus describing his travels, from inscriptions on dedications and decrees, from the occasional Greek pottery shard turning up at an Egyptian site, or an Egyptian amulet appearing in a Greek context. The picture that emerged from those fragments was coherent enough. There was trade, there was contact, there were Greek merchants living in designated areas of Egypt, there were diplomatic and religious exchanges, but it was a picture assembled from scattered evidence, and it had gaps in it that no one was entirely sure how to fill. The physical reality of that contact, the actual texture of what a shared Egyptian-Greek commercial and religious space looked like on the ground, was largely missing. Thonis-Heracleion fills that gap in a way that no amount of additional textual analysis could have. It is not just that the city confirms things we suspected, or corroborates things we read in old sources. It is that it provides a completely different category of evidence. You can read Herodotus describing the customs port at the mouth of the Canopic branch of the Nile, and you can believe him, or doubt him, or argue about what exactly he meant. But when you can descend into Abu Kirbe and see the harbour infrastructure, the anchors, the ships, the temple precinct, the Greek pottery in one district and the Egyptian ritual objects in another, that is not a matter of interpretation in the same way. The city was real, the contact was real, the coexistence was real, and it was more complex, more organised, and more deeply embedded in the religious and commercial life of both cultures than the textual record alone could have shown. One of the more significant things the site has done is to rehabilitate Herodotus in the eyes of scholars who had grown sceptical of some of his claims. Herodotus has always been a complicated figure in ancient historiography, a genuinely curious and careful observer in some respects, but also someone who repeated stories he could not verify and occasionally described things in ways that seemed implausible or exaggerated. His mention of Heracleion and his account of the temple there was one of those details that some modern scholars had treated with mild suspicion. It was hard to evaluate a claim about a city whose location was unknown. Once the city was found, and once the temple precinct was excavated and shown to match, in its general character and its religious function, what Herodotus described, that skepticism became harder to maintain. Not every detail Herodotus recorded about Egypt has been verified by the Thonis-Heracleion excavation, and it would be an overstatement to say the site has vindicated everything he wrote. but it has demonstrated in a concrete and physical way that his account of the city's existence and importance was accurate. That matters for how we read him, and by extension for how we read other ancient sources, whose claims we cannot yet verify archaeologically. The site also changes the story of Alexandria. This is perhaps the most significant reframing that Thonis-Heracleion produces. Alexandria is often told as a story of creation. Alexander arrives in 331 BCE. He looks at a stretch of coast. He envisions a great city, and he builds it. And within a generation it becomes the largest city in the world, the centre of Hellenistic learning, the home of the Great Library, the meeting point of Greek and Egyptian and Jewish and later Roman civilization. It is a founding story, and like most founding stories, it has a slightly miraculous quality to it. A city rising from nothing, shaped by the vision of one man and the ambitions of his successors. What Thonis-Heracleion shows is that Alexandria did not rise from nothing. It rose from an already sophisticated, already cosmopolitan, already deeply interconnected world. The Greek merchants who came to Alexandria had been coming to Egypt for generations before Alexander was born. They had been living in Thonis-Heracleion, trading through its harbour, observing its religious ceremonies, setting up their own small sanctuaries within its boundaries, learning to navigate Egyptian customs law, and building relationships with Egyptian priests and officials and merchants. The cultural infrastructure that made Alexandria possible, the familiarity between Greek and Egyptian ways of doing things, the established patterns of trade and religious exchange, the networks of merchants and translators and administrators who knew how to operate in a mixed cultural environment, all of that already existed. Thonis-Heracleion was not a precursor to Alexandria in a vague general sense. It was the specific place where that cultural infrastructure was built and maintained for at least 3 centuries before Alexandria existed. When Alexander founded Alexandria, and it began to draw trade and population away from Thonis-Heracleion, he was not creating something new out of a vacuum. He was redirecting something that was already there. The merchants moved. The trade routes shifted. The administrative functions transferred to the new city. But the knowledge, the habits, the cultural mixing, those things had roots that went back through Thonis-Heracleion, through the late period, through the first Greek traders who arrived at the canopic mouth of the Nile, and were directed to the customs port to declare their cargo and pay their taxes and receive permission to proceed into Egypt. Alexandria inherited a world that Thonis-Heracleion had already created. That is a meaningful revision to one of the most famous city-founding stories in history. There is also something that Thonis-Heracleion teaches us about how ancient cities disappeared, and this lesson is quieter, but perhaps more unsettling than any of the historical revisions. We tend to think of cities ending in dramatic ways: conquest, fire, plague, abandonment. These cities we know best from ancient history mostly ended in ways that left visible traces. The destruction layers that archaeologists find, the burned buildings, the hastily buried hoards of coins, the skeletal remains of people who did not make it out. Even cities that faded gradually, like Rome in the early medieval period, left above-ground ruins that were never entirely forgotten. The Colosseum was always there. The Pantheon was always there. The city shrank and changed, but it did not vanish. Thonis-Heracleion vanished, not through conquest, not through fire, not through any human violence, through geology, through the slow, patient, indifferent process of the earth shifting beneath a city that had been built on ground that was never entirely stable. The Nile Delta is not solid land in the way that most people imagine land to be. It is a vast accumulation of sediment deposited over thousands of years, saturated with water, subject to compaction and subsidence, vulnerable to the kind of liquefaction that turns apparently firm ground into something closer to liquid when it is shaken or stressed. The people who built Thonis-Heracleion were not unaware of their environment. They built a city of canals and basins and artificial islands precisely because they understood that they were living in a place where water and land were not entirely separate things, but the geological forces working against them were operating on timescales that no individual and no generation could fully perceive. The city sank slowly. That is the most important thing to understand about its disappearance. It did not go down in a single night, the way the legend of Atlantis describes, or the way a dramatic documentary might want you to imagine. It subsided incrementally over decades and possibly centuries. Buildings that began to tilt or crack were probably repaired or abandoned. Areas that flooded more frequently were probably avoided. The population likely shrank gradually as the city became less habitable and less economically central. The latter process accelerated by the rise of Alexandria, which drew away the trade and the people who had sustained Thonis-Heracleion for so long. By the time the final submersion occurred, it is possible that there was relatively little left to submerge. The living city may have already retreated, leaving behind its temples and its harbour infrastructure and its accumulated material culture to be sealed by the silt. This is a different kind of ending than the ones we usually tell, and it is in some ways a more instructive one, because the geological conditions that caused Thonis-Heracleion to sink are not unique to the ancient world. The Nile Delta is still subsiding. Sea levels are still rising, and the rate of rise has accelerated in recent decades. Cities built on river deltas and coastal plains around the world, cities very much alive and inhabited today, are subject to versions of the same pressures that eventually swallowed Thonis-Heracleion. The processes are slower or faster depending on location, but the basic physics are the same. Soft sediment compacts under weight. Land near the coast subsides as groundwater is extracted, and as the sediment deposited by rivers is no longer replenished at the same rate. Sea levels rise as ice melts, and ocean water expands. The combination of these forces is not a future possibility. It is a present reality in places like Jakarta, which has been sinking at rates of up to 25 centimetres per year in some districts, in Bangkok, in parts of the Mississippi Delta, in coastal areas of Bangladesh and Vietnam and the Netherlands. Thonis-Heracleion is sometimes described as a lesson from the past. That framing is accurate, but it is worth being specific about what the lesson is. It is not simply that cities can be lost, we knew that. It is that a city can be lost without any dramatic cause, without any enemy, without any plague or fire or catastrophic event that a contemporary observer could have pointed to and said, "This is what destroyed us." The city was lost because the ground it was built on was not as solid as it appeared, and because the sea is patient in ways that human civilizations are not. That is the kind of loss that is very hard to plan for, very hard to see coming, and very easy to underestimate until it is too late to reverse. The people of Thonis-Heracleion did not know they were living in a city that would one day be 6.5 meters underwater. They built temples and harbours and canal systems that were meant to last. The stele of Necht Nebo I was carved in hard pink granite and inscribed with a tax decree that was intended to be permanent, a statement of royal authority and divine order that would stand for as long as the kingdom stood. The colossal statue of Hapi, the god of the Nile's flood, was not a temporary installation. It was a declaration of the city's relationship with the natural forces that sustained it. The people who made these things were not naive about their environment. They were simply operating within a human timescale, and the geological timescale had different plans. What the discovery of Thonis-Heracleion does, when you hold all of this together, is complicate the distance between ancient history and the present in a way that is genuinely useful. Ancient history can feel remote, separated from us not just by time but by a kind of categorical difference, as if the people who built these cities and carved these inscriptions were operating in a world so different from ours that their experience offers no real mirror for our own. Thonis-Heracleion makes that distance harder to maintain. The city was cosmopolitan. It was a place where people from different cultures lived and traded and worshipped in close proximity, negotiating the practical difficulties of that coexistence through law and custom, and the gradual accumulation of shared habits. It was economically central to a region that connected the Mediterranean world to the African interior. It was built on land that was slowly, imperceptibly giving way beneath it. None of those things are remote. All of them are recognizable. And the fact that it was found at all, that it was not simply lost forever, that the sediment preserved it rather than destroying it, that a French archaeologist with a magnetometer and a research vessel happened to be surveying that particular bay at the end of the 20th century, that is its own kind of remarkable thing. The city had been waiting under the water for somewhere between 1200 and 2000 years, depending on which part of it you were measuring. The statues were still standing, or lying where they had fallen, in the same positions they had occupied since the ground shifted beneath them. The ships were still in the harbour, more or less, resting in the silt where they had gone down. The stele was still legible, the bronze pharaoh was still there. There is something in that persistence that is hard to name precisely. Not hope, exactly, though it is not entirely unlike hope. More like a quiet reminder that the past does not always destroy itself as thoroughly as we assume, that things can survive in unexpected places, in unexpected conditions, waiting for the right combination of technology and curiosity and careful attention to bring them back into contact with the present. The excavation of Thonis-Heracleion is still ongoing, and the questions it raises about the pre-Alexandrian Mediterranean world, about the mechanics of cultural exchange, about the geology of coastal civilizations, about the nature of loss and preservation, those questions are not yet fully answered. They are still being worked through, season by season, in the murky water above a city that turned out to be exactly where the ancient sources said it was, if you knew how to look. Which brings us finally back to the surface of Abu Qir Bay and to the question of what it means to know that the city is still down there. The water above Abu Qir Bay at night is very dark. There is no light coming up from below, no visible trace of what rests on the seafloor 6.5 meters down. From the surface, it looks like any other stretch of the Mediterranean, flat or gently moving depending on the wind, reflecting whatever skies above it, giving nothing away. You would not know, looking at it, that you were floating above a city, above a harbour that once processed the trade of an entire civilization, above temples and canals, and the stone faces of pharaohs that have been resting in the silt for longer than most countries have existed. That invisibility is part of what makes Thonis-Heracleion so strange to think about. It was not buried under a desert, where the logic of concealment at least feels intuitive. It was not hidden in a jungle or sealed behind a rockfall. It was sitting under a moderate depth of open water, a few kilometres off the coast of one of the most historically studied regions in the world, and for over 1,000 years nobody found it. Not because nobody was looking exactly, but because nobody thought to look there. The assumption was that cities leave traces above the waterline, that if something this significant had existed, there would be ruins, a mound, some surface evidence that could be spotted and mapped and excavated in the conventional way. Thonis-Heracleion did not cooperate with that assumption. It simply waited. There is something almost patient about the way this city has persisted. That is probably not the right word to apply to an inanimate collection of stone and silt, but it keeps suggesting itself. The colossal statue of Hapi, the god of the Nile's flood, did not degrade into unrecognizable rubble. It fell at some point during the centuries of slow subsidence and came to rest on the seafloor, and the fine silt settled around it, and it stayed there. 5.4 meters of pink granite, the god of abundance and water resting underwater. The bronze pharaoh, roughly 2 meters tall, was not corroded into nothing. It was preserved by the same anaerobic conditions in the sediment that have kept organic materials intact. Wooden ship timbers, ceramic residues, the traces of things that by any reasonable expectation should have disappeared long ago. The stele of Nectanebo I, carved in the 4th century BCE, is still legible. The inscription is still there, the royal decree about tax collection at the port of Thonis, intended as a permanent statement of authority, turned out to be permanent in a way its makers could not have anticipated. There is a particular kind of irony in that. The people who carved that stele were trying to make something that would last, and they succeeded. But the way it lasted, sealed in silt under the sea, was not what they had in mind. The authority it was meant to project, the sense of order and permanence it was meant to convey to merchants arriving at the port, all of that context dissolved centuries ago. What survived was the object itself, stripped of its original function, transformed by time into something else entirely. Not a legal document, but an artifact. Not a declaration of power, but a piece of evidence, a material witness to a world that no longer exists above the waterline. That transformation is what archaeology does, in a sense. It takes things that were made for one purpose and reads them for another. The ships in the harbour of Thonis-Heracleion were not meant to be studied. They were working vessels, trading boats, ceremonial barks, warships, built to carry goods and people and the symbolic weight of religious procession. They sank, or were abandoned, or were swallowed by the subsiding ground, and the silt covered them, and 2,000 years later they became evidence of shipbuilding techniques and trade patterns, and the material culture of a port city at the end of the late period. The gold jewellery found in the sediment was not left there as a museum exhibit. It was lost, or abandoned, or simply left behind as the city slowly became uninhabitable. Now it tells us something about the people who wore it, about the craft traditions of the city, about the kind of wealth that moved through this place. What Frank Godio's team has been doing in Abu Kirbeh since 2000 is a form of patient translation. The city is speaking, in the only language it has left, and the work of the excavation is to listen carefully enough to understand what it is saying. That work is not finished. By the most conservative estimates, somewhere between 95 and 97% of the site has not yet been fully excavated. The funerary complex found in 2021, the Ptolemaic-era military vessel found in 2022 under 5 meters of clay and shipwreck debris. Those are relatively recent finds, and the excavation seasons continue. There is almost certainly more to come. More ships, more statues, more inscriptions, more small objects, the rings and amulets and ceramic vessels and bronze figurines that accumulate in any inhabited place over centuries of daily life. The city has been giving up its content slowly, and there is no particular reason to think it has finished. That is one of the things that distinguishes Thonis-Heracleion from many famous archaeological sites. It is not a finished story. It is not a place where the excavation was completed and the findings were catalogued and the site was open to tourists and the narrative was closed. It is an active discovery, still unfolding, still capable of producing surprises. The question of what else is down there is not rhetorical. It is a genuine open question, and the people working on it do not know the answer. That uncertainty is part of what makes it interesting, but it is also a reminder that what we know about this city right now is almost certainly incomplete, that the picture we have assembled from 20 plus years of careful underwater work is a partial picture, drawn from a small fraction of the total evidence, and yet even the partial picture is remarkable. Before 2000, Thonis-Heracleion was a name in old texts. It was a reference in Herodotus that scholars acknowledged but could not verify physically. It was a city without coordinates, a port without a location, a piece of the ancient world that existed only in language. Now it exists in 3 dimensions. Its streets have been mapped, at least partially. Its temple precinct has been measured and photographed. Its harbour has been charted. The statues that stood in its public spaces have been raised from the sediment and conserved and studied and in some cases exhibited. The city has been, in a limited but real sense, recovered. That recovery does not restore it to what it was. The temple of Amun-Gereb will not be rebuilt. The harbour will not be dredged and refilled with trading vessels. The merchants and priests and customs officials and Greek sailors who gave the city its life are not coming back. What has been recovered is knowledge, the specific, material, irreplaceable kind of knowledge that only comes from physical evidence. the knowledge that the city existed at this location and at this scale, the knowledge that it was a place of genuine cultural complexity, where Egyptian religious practice and Greek commercial culture and the political authority of the pharaohs all coexisted in the same space, negotiating with each other through the practical arrangements of daily life. The knowledge that it sank not because of any enemy or catastrophe, but because the ground beneath it was always slowly giving way. That knowledge changes things, not dramatically, not overnight, but in the quiet way that new evidence always changes things, by requiring us to revise the picture we had and replace it with one that is more accurate and more complete. The history of the pre-Alexandrian Mediterranean is different now than it was before this city was found. The relationship between Egypt and the Greek world in the centuries before Alexander is understood differently. The question of where Alexandria came from, what kind of place and what kind of tradition it was built to replace and surpass, has a more concrete answer. Alexandria did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from a world that already had Thonis-Heracleion, already had centuries of Greek-Egyptian contact and trade and religious exchange, already had the infrastructure and the habits of cosmopolitan commerce. Alexandria was a successor, not a beginning. There is something grounding about that. History tends to glorify the new and forget the old, and Alexandria is one of the great examples of that tendency. The famous city that overshadowed and eventually replaced the city that came before it. Thonis-Heracleion was not remembered. It was not celebrated. It faded from the historical record as its economic importance declined, and it sank from the physical world as the delta slowly gave way beneath it, and for more than 1,000 years it was simply absent. The texts that mentioned it were still there, but without physical confirmation they carried only so much weight. It took a magnetometer and a research vessel, and a team of underwater archaeologists working in murky water above the Egyptian coast to give those texts their body back. There is also something worth sitting with in the way the city was preserved. The water that swallowed Thonis-Heracleion was also the water that kept it. If the city had been abandoned on dry land, it would have been quarried. Its stones would have been taken for other buildings, as happened to countless ancient sites across Egypt and the Mediterranean. Its statues would have been broken up or removed. Its metal objects would have been melted down. The ordinary entropy of human habitation, the recycling of materials, the clearing of old structures to make room for new ones, the gradual dismantling of anything that is no longer useful would have consumed it. Instead, it sank. The silt covered it. The anaerobic conditions of the seafloor slowed the decay of organic materials to almost nothing. The city was sealed, more or less intact, in a condition that no above-ground site could have matched. That is not a comfortable thought exactly. The preservation came at the cost of the city itself, its people, its function, its place in the living world. But the result is that what was lost was also, in a strange way, kept. Not for the people who lived there, not in any form they would have recognised or wanted, but for the people who came 2,000 years later with sonar equipment and dive suits and the ability to read ancient Greek and Egyptian inscriptions, kept for us, in a sense, though we had nothing to do with it. If you're listening to this somewhere quiet tonight, wherever you are, whatever the temperature is outside your window, whether it is raining or still, it is worth taking a moment with that image, a city under the water, not a ruin, not a pile of rubble, but something more like a city that simply stopped in place. The columns of the temple of Amun-Gereb lying on the seafloor where they fell. The anchors still in the harbour, more than 700 of them resting in the silt. The stele still inscribed with its tax decree, still legible after 24 centuries. The bronze pharaoh still standing or still lying in the sediment of Abu Qir Bay, a few kilometres off the coast of modern Egypt, under 6.5 metres of water that gives nothing away from the surface. That city is still there right now. While you are listening to this, it is there. While the ships pass overhead and the fishing boats go out in the morning, and the light changes on the surface of the bay through the day and the night, the city is there, below all of it, in the dark and the quiet of the sea floor. The excavation continues in season, but the rest of the time the city is simply resting, the way it has been resting for most of the last 2,000 years. Patient, if that word applies. Present, certainly. What it means to find something like this, a city that was lost and is now partially found, is not a simple question. It means different things depending on what you bring to it. For archaeologists, it means evidence, data, the physical confirmation of historical claims that could not previously be verified. For historians, it means a revised understanding of a period and a region that was already well studied, but turns out to have been less well understood than it appeared. For the people of Egypt, it means something about the depth and complexity of their country's history, about the layers of civilization that rest beneath the modern surface of that ancient land. For anyone who has ever been interested in the question of what we do not know, in the genuine, unresolved uncertainty of the historical record, it means that the gaps are sometimes filled in ways that are more complete and more surprising than we had any right to expect. And for anyone listening quietly tonight, in whatever room or corner of the world you're in, it might just mean this, that the past is not as finished as it seems, that things can persist in unexpected places, that a city can sit under the water for 2,000 years and still be there when someone finally thinks to look, that the world still has things in it that have not yet been found, questions that have not yet been answered, names in old texts that are still waiting for their physical address to be confirmed. Thonis-Heracleion was one of those names. It was a city mentioned by Herodotus, and then, for all practical purposes, lost. And then it was found 6.5 meters down in Abu Kirbeh, northeast of Alexandria, preserved by the very water that had swallowed it. The stele was still there. The statues were still there. The ships were still there. It had been waiting a long time. It is still there now. Thank you for spending this time here tonight. If this story left you thinking about something, about what else might be waiting under the water, or about what we assume we know about the ancient world, or simply about the strange persistence of things, I would genuinely love to hear it in the comments. And if you found this worth your evening, a like and a subscribe go a long way toward making sure more of these stories can find their way to you. Take care of yourself, wherever you are. Sleep well.